Folks, can we start moving to our chairs? Thank you. We're going to start in 2 minutes. Good morning. Those of you who want to sit must do so now. Otherwise, we're going to close up all the other chairs. That includes all you people talking over there. Hi, my name is Bob Perciasepe. I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES, and I'd like to welcome all of you here today to this event, which we're calling State-of-the-Art Innovations in Carbon Capture and Use. We've had so much interest in this session and these work and the panel discussions and the comments from the senators this morning that we're actually live streaming today. And somebody, I should have written it down, somebody told me to do this, but I didn't. There's a Twitter hashtag for this event that all of you can be tweeting away while I'm talking. C2ES is a nonpartisan think tank, and we work on pragmatic solutions, and we work with everyone, whatever the political point of view is. Our objective is to look for solutions that can work and that can work for a broad group of people. One of those solutions is what we're talking about today, carbon capture, use and storage. And it's being deployed now in dozens of locations around the world. And in the United States, we have activity in Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, Wyoming. And there's much cutting-edge research being done about the technology, about the use of carbon, and we'll be hearing more about that today. So this technology exists, and more is being developed, and more innovation is occurring. But what we really need is to get more of it deployed. And that's something that everyone can agree on. And we have a work group, an initiative that we have a great partner. We're actually a partner of theirs, the Great Plains Institute. And Brad Crabtree, who I want to at least raise your hand over there, Brad, is here today as well from the Great Plains Institute. Between Great Plains and C2ES, we've been working on an activity called the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, which brings together stakeholders from across the spectrum, from industry, from labor, environmental groups, all working at looking at how this can be part of the solution. And we also have an amazing amount of support in the United States Congress. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle see multiple benefits from carbon capture and use to reduce emissions, to boost energy production, and to promote economic growth. And that's why we're so excited to see such strong bipartisan support for carbon capture. Senators like Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota, Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, Shelley Capito from, whack the microphone there, from West Virginia, and Senator Barrasso from Wyoming, who's just joined us. Thank you all for coming today, and we really appreciate the effort that you all have been making. Some of you may have been with us this summer when the 4 senators introduced the Future Act in the Senate. We know today that the companion bill has now been introduced or being introduced today in the House of Representatives, another bipartisan effort in the House of Representatives. So this is, we feel there's momentum underway here, and we're very excited about today. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Senator Heitkamp to make some remarks.
Thank you. I'm going to try and keep my remarks short. I am beyond excited about what's been happening in this space. Just to give you a little background, I served as a member of an outside board of directors member for Dakota Gasification. Dakota Gasification is a wholly owned C Corp subsidiary of Basin Electric. It was this amazing project that was created back in the 70s when everybody thought that there wasn't enough oil and there wasn't enough natural gas, and to be energy independent, we needed to use that coal resource by changing it into natural gas, changing it into liquids, huge, as we call it, laboratory on the prairie. And as things would happen when we deregulated natural gas prices plummeted. We found out we had more natural gas, and all of a sudden the plant really was not cost effective. And so over the next 20 years, really, Basin Electric, who bought the plant from the federal government, made that plant more and more cost effective, was able to cash flow the facility. One of the great stories that people don't tell enough about what Basin did is you assume that the CO2 capture was just part of their attempt to meet environmental regulations or anticipate perhaps some credits that they would get. That's not true. They started the CO2 capture project as a way to enhance the valuable byproducts that could be produced from a facility like that. And so when people told me that you could not see coal being used in a carbon neutral way and no one would ever do it, the technology didn't exist, that was a hard sell with me, because I sat at that board meeting every month and listened to what we were doing every month. Now, understand that the CO2 that we captured was compressed, sent north, and enhanced oil recovery. As things progressed and as we look at what's happening more and more with enhanced oil recovery, we know that we can continue to build the economic opportunities for CO2 in enhanced oil recovery. But we also know that these technologies that now are being used at SAS Power, now are being used at Petronova, amazing things that are happening across the country, are proving over and over and over again that the technology exists, and that the technology can be commercialized, and that we can, in fact, play a role in addressing carbon emissions, even though we're people who promote and support the coal industry. And so let me tell you kind of the story of this bill. And I really do have to give a shout out to Brad Crabtree from my home state. Very early on, he spent a lot of time visiting with me about how this could work if we enhanced and expanded the 45Q credit line, and that we could, in fact, develop technologies. But there's two stories here. One is the growing awareness that CO2 capture, sequestration, and utilization can be part of the global energy picture. It can be part of the global industrial picture, because very many facilities in Europe are using this technology behind cement plants. We're thinking about using it behind ethanol plants. So we can't just focus on the coal piece. So I think that there is now a growing awareness that the technology exists. But what's truly remarkable, and it's kind of amazing that I would say this, but what is truly remarkable is that we've been able to build a bipartisan, amazingly bipartisan and diverse group. You know, it's one thing to be bipartisan. You know, I think people would say, well, if Susan Collins and Heidi Heitkamp are on the bill, that's not really very bipartisan. They're pretty ideologically connected. But think about this. Last Congress, we had my friend Sheldon, Whitehouse just came into the room. We had Sheldon, who is well known, gives a speech every week about climate, and Mitch McConnell on the same bill. And then we had the leadership of Senator Barrasso, the chairman of the EPW committee, who was willing to come on, and Shelley, willing to not just come onto this bill, but be huge advocates. And I heard your comments, Senator Barrasso, yesterday. So grateful that you're willing to stand so firmly on behalf of this bill as the four of us continue to promote it. And so, you know, if nothing else, this should also serve as a beacon of hope for the ability that the United States Congress has to take one of the most divisive issues of our time, which is climate and coal, and find a path forward that we can all work on together. That's truly remarkable, and we're very, very proud of the work that we're doing, very proud. So let me tell you what some of the challenges for the Future Act will be. We came very close a number of times to getting this enacted in law, making sure, you know, getting amendments that were considered. Our hopes kind of have gone like this, right? We're up, we're down. I think right now the biggest challenge we have is making sure that 45Q does not get left behind in the discussions on tax reform. And so I've spent a lot of time, as you probably have read in the paper, talking to the administration about tax reform. I don't ever talk about tax reform with the administration without talking about legacy wind and solar tax credits, but the need to include 45Q as a legacy credit for the development of this technology. And so we're going to continue to push. I think yesterday, the good outcome from the hearing yesterday that Senator Barrasso held was that we're getting a number of inquiries from other members who are really intrigued and excited. And so we're going to continue to build our political support for this. But we need groups like this. We need organizations like this to continue to talk about this is not pie in the sky technology. This is real technology. It can serve the purpose, and we can get this done. And so want to thank Julio Friedmann, a great friend that we worked with last Congress, but continues to work on this. There's great people here, great minds here who understand the technology. I know you guys are going to be just intrigued by what you hear today. So thank you so much for letting me come, and thanks again to my colleagues for their efforts on behalf of this bill.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Bob. Good to be with you. Heidi, thank you. Good to see you. Senator Capito, Chairman, good to be with you all. We are the unlikely foursome on this subject, but I think one area where there is broad bipartisan agreement is that if we are going to solve the problem of carbon emissions and climate change, we're going to need to have a whole array of possible solutions that come to bear on the problem. I'm from Rhode Island. Rhode Island we call ourselves the ocean state. We got in before Hawaii, so we could call that name, and Hawaii has to be the aloha state. But we take our ocean economy and our ocean recreational opportunities very, very seriously. We are really renowned in that respect. And if you go to my website, you can see a 4+ minute video that I've done that shows what our own university and our own coastal council predicts for the changes to our shoreline. Rhode Island goes back a long, long time. And now we are looking at, in the lifetime of a little girl born at Women and Infants Hospital today, dramatic changes. Block Island, which many of you have heard of, one of the Nature Conservancy's last great places, becomes block islands. They break apart as the sea rises. Jamestown, where my senior senator lives, becomes 3, not 1 islands. Warwick Neck, big residential section of one of our most important cities, becomes an island itself. The towns of Warren and Bristol, 2 historic towns, break off from shore and become islands. In Tiverton, there's a new island that emerges from what's now called Fogland Point, and we're going to need to do some very, very significant building to have a seawall that protects Providence. Now, Providence is in kind of a declivity like this, so you can actually build a wall across the opening fairly easily and defend it. Up in Boston, they're talking to the Dutch about how the hell you defend Boston. Because Boston Harbor, you have to build multiple walls between multiple islands around the harbor and then build a lock someplace so that the offshore traffic can come in and then drop down to the historic sea level and then continue to come into Boston without flooding the old city. So we are looking at truly destructive changes to the very shape and nature of our state. And so I feel considerable urgency about getting something done, and one of those tranches is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Pumping it underground, using it for enhanced oil recovery, having it bond with certain geological strata to actually harden up when it hits them and stay, solidify, stripping it out of the air, stripping it out of the water. We have a significant aquaculture economy. You can't grow an oyster in acidic water that eats away the shell of the little villager oyster more rapidly than it can grow it. So that whole industry just disappears. We've seen that already happen on the West Coast, preview of coming attractions for us. So the acidification of the oceans, which is an undeniable chemical fact. I actually did a little experiment on the Senate floor and blew through an aquarium bubble into a glass of the water that the pages give us, and with pH dye showed the before and after of the dramatic pH change just one breath blown through the water does. So we know that the absorption of 30% of the excess carbon dioxide emissions by the ocean changes it chemically, and that's going to be pretty dramatic. So this is important. We need to work together on it. I hope that there are other areas that we can work together as well. The point that I'll make in closing in terms of, I think we're in pretty good shape on this. We need to round up a bunch more Republican co-sponsors so it doesn't get too out of balance. I think we're like 25-9 right now, and that's about the limit. If it gets to 48-9, people start to panic about, oh no, this isn't a fair balanced bill. So, but I think if we can get to a significant group of people who will co-sponsor it or tell the leader that they will vote for it, then we're in a pretty good place to get this passed. So I'm feeling reasonably comfortable about this, and I think the next thing we need to really start thinking about is a price on carbon, because all of the witnesses yesterday agreed that the thing that's stopping this from going is that there's no revenue stream. There's no reward for doing it, and if there's not a price on carbon, there's never going to be revenues for this. If nobody will pay you for eliminating carbon emissions, then you're not going to get a lot of investment in reducing carbon emissions, whether you're making algae or doing enhanced oil recovery or pumping it into the ground or extracting it from the air or whatever you're doing. So that takes us to this next point, which is this question of what the social cost of carbon is and how we should bake it into a real market. I think that every single economist in the country believes that there needs to be a price on carbon, because that's just basic market theory. You shouldn't have negative externalities in a market environment. That's kind of market 101. So how do we get there? One thing that is, I think, going to help to push us is that all the courts that have looked at this, every single one, 3 United States Circuit Courts of Appeals, multiple district courts, and some very significant administrative agencies, from state PUCs to federal administrative agencies, have said you got to have a social cost of carbon baked into your decision making, or else it doesn't meet the Administrative Procedures Act standard of being not arbitrary and not capricious. And from a legal point of view, you fail the test if you don't have that baked in. That is happening over and over, and it is, without exception, the finding. So that, I think, is a very good step and allows us some progress to try to bake it in. Shelley and John are from states that are highly economically dependent on coal. It is a very significant problem for them, and as much as I hope that they will consider the suffering and the woes of Rhode Island's ocean economy, I pledge that I understand and sympathize with the sufferings and woes of their coal economy. But what are you going to do about it? If you can put a proper price on carbon, you suddenly have a revenue stream that can, to quote Huey Long, make every miner a king. You can pave the streets of coal country with gold for not too much money. You can protect Wyoming's 64% revenue stream that comes out of carbon. You can make sure that when Shelley goes to the hollers of West Virginia, people are grateful to see her. She has delivered something that has made their lives better, and that her name and President Trump's name will be uttered by their grandchildren for having helped Grandpa out of the predicament that the market had put this fuel into. So there's lots of opportunity here, and I'm excited that this is a piece of it that is moving forward, and I encourage you to keep the pressure on, because when the day comes that it is clear that we have missed this boat, and that it was the type of politics that it's been that has caused us to miss this boat, can be very hard to show that America is the city on a hill Ronald Reagan said it was when we've blown it this badly, this publicly. Let's not go there. Let's get this done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Capito.
Well, thank you, Bob, and Sheldon, and Heidi, and Chairman Barrasso. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be here with all of you. I was looking at your panel, and we had a great hearing in EPW committee yesterday with several of your panelists. There he is, Julio. They were great. And I learned a lot about something that I thought I already knew a lot about. But what I learned by listening to Sheldon is when he talked about my name in West Virginia with President Trump's name, did you all hear him say that he wanted to build a wall? I think that's what we need to tell President, that you were wanting to build a wall, Sheldon. I don't have to tell him where and how and who's going to pay for it, but that's a great clip from you. Anyway, I thought I'd add a little levity to the morning on a very serious subject. Senator Heitkamp has been such a great leader on this issue, and I've learned a lot from her, but I've learned also that her compassion around this issue, and that she devoted an entire radio show to this, and she invited Sheldon and I to come on and be her guests. So I'm sure with the multi-millions of people that listen to the radio interview, Heidi, that we're going to have all kinds of support here. But I think we will have all kinds of support here, just sort of on a more topical or a larger topic kind of way, the way I see it, coming from a coal-producing state. And this came up in the hearing yesterday slightly. But number one, the energy independence of what we're looking at here. We have a great opportunity in this country to not just capitalize on our energy, but become energy independent, which translates into an energy economy and growing jobs and preserving jobs and stabilizing jobs. One of the questions from the senator from California yesterday to Dr. Friedmann was how does employing the technology of CCUS, what does this do in terms of jobs and job creation? He did a good job of talking about all of the, not just new jobs and jobs of the future that are connected with this, but also with the sustainability of some of the jobs that we have now and how this will sustain them for the future and in a lot of different ways. And I added in, this helps coal miners in every single way, because in order to keep mining coal, we do have to move in this direction. We know this, and that's why some of the research that's gone on is in our neck of the woods at the National Energy Technology Lab. We're doing a lot of research there, also at West Virginia University, because it is our economic an economic benefit to us. It's jobs, it's wages, it's raising your family, it's living in a state that you love. I think also as we're developing this technology, and hopefully this bill that we talked about, the Future Act, will lead us to this, it's important for us to realize also what an economic driver being able to deploy the technology around the world is. If we become, and when we become the leader here as we are moving in that direction, we can then deploy the technology around areas that don't have electricity now, that have maybe availability of a less expensive energy source such as coal, but also keep the environmental considerations front and center. So I'm excited about the economic benefits of deploying the technology that I think this Future Act will drive. We have a great bipartisan, I was just at a meeting earlier this morning, and they're like, can you get some kind of bipartisanship going here? I said, unfortunately, we do have a lot of bipartisanship that goes in a lot of different ways. It's just the big issues that get covered in the media sometimes look like we're not talking, we're not working together, we're not seeking solutions. And I hope one of the takeaways that you take away from today is that we are working together to try to figure out a way to get Sheldon Whitehouse and Shelley Capito on a same bill when we have divergent views many times in the EPW committee. We are working towards this, and I look forward to getting more co-sponsors and with your all's help, making sure that the economic benefits from moving forward to this, and the energy independence and security that will come along with it are something that we can all take advantage of. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Chairman, Senator Barrasso, I think it's your turn. I also want to add the thanks for the hearing you guys had yesterday. It's outstanding, and we really appreciate it. Come on up.
Well, Bob, first I wanted to thank you for your leadership through the years, and I appreciate everyone being here. It's great to be here with Sheldon and Shelley. And I will tell you, in terms of Heidi, we actually met for the first time. You weren't a senator yet, but it was in Gillette, Wyoming, at the opening of the Dry Fork power plant, which was the last coal-fired power plant to open in the United States. And you were there because of your role in leadership of Basin Electric. So that's where our connection and friendship began, was at a coal-fired power plant in Gillette, Wyoming. And from the hearing yesterday, Matt Fry, who testified, is in charge of this program, the Integrated Test Center, that deals with the coal issues in Gillette and trying to find better ways to scale, deal with the things that we're trying to deal with here, with carbon capture, utilization, sequestration. And I thought we had a terrific panel. You know, so often you have, the Republican, Democrat. We had three excellent people testifying, and Dave Greeson is here. He's on your first panel, and Julio Friedmann is here, and he's on one of the panels this morning. You can tell what party people are. We were all working together for the benefit of America to make sure that we can give people affordable energy, reliable energy. The thing I like about Heidi, and we talk a lot about energy, I think one time you said, we were talking about oil. You said, you don't want to give the keys to the car to the guy that wants to keep all the oil in the ground, because there's a gap between the reliable energy that we need to power the country and the renewable energy, which is good, important, has to be part of the mix, but isn't enough at this point to power the country and deal with the needs. So I always think about the three E's when I think about energy, which is energy security, economic strength, and environmental stewardship. And I think what we're doing here with the Future Act is aimed at all of those components. And Shelley and I visit regularly. We can often sit next to each other at the EPW committee, working on these very issues, looking for ways to do things in a bipartisan way. And as you said, it is good to see the bipartisanship, which means it probably will not be reported in the press, because when people are getting and working together. But I think many people don't realize how often we do work together. I mean, Sheldon and I went with John McCain, basically to look at climate changes, and we went to Norway, and we've both been to Svalbard, and really up there in the northern parts of the planet. The one thing is, when you're traveling with John McCain, Sheldon and I continued to get the same question no matter wherever we went. People would come up, so you're with Senator McCain, and say, yes. Then they'd hand you their cell phone and say, will you please take a picture of me with Senator McCain? Bipartisan. But I just wanted to be here to express my appreciation for what you're all doing, to work on this legislation in a bipartisan way. We all want to make energy as clean as we can, as fast as we can, do it in a responsible way. And I think that we're doing that here today, and why we're working so hard together in a bipartisan way as part of this legislation. I'm delighted with the panel that you put together. And again, Bob, thanks so much for your leadership. Thanks for having me.
All right, recognizing the senator's relentless schedules, we'll let you guys make your, but it's really important to us that you all came today and gave us more of a pep talk. We really appreciate it, and we hope we can do well to help you put some wind in the sails here. Thank you all. Thank you for your leadership. All right. We are stunningly on schedule, so everybody take a nap. No. I want to call the panel up, our first panel here, for the next discussion. I see that this podium is going to be in the way. I don't know if I can move it. But when we're all sitting here, the people over there are not going to be able to see us. I'll carry on anyway. Okay, so Our first panel is going to talk a little bit about the corporate investment in CO2 utilization. I'll do my best to moderate it, but everybody's going to make an opening comment. David Greeson, Vice President of Development from NRG Energy, and of course they've been involved with the Petronova project. Al Collins, Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs from Occidental Petroleum Corporation, and Christopher Romans, from the Senior Manager for Government Affairs at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in America. And we're really appreciative of all of you coming today, and we'll start with David.
Thanks, Bob. It's an honor to be here and talk to you about a very exciting project I've worked on for the last 7 years. Always happy to get up and talk about all the wonderful people that I worked with over those years to bring that project online. Well, we're 8 months into operations at the Petronova project, and all is going well. The CO2 capture system provided by Mitsubishi is working as promised, and we've had really no issues. The capture system side of the project is working great. The CO2 pipeline that we built, 82 miles, 120 kilometers for those that are metric, has had no issues. All our landowners are happy with us, and the operations in the oil field are ramping up. You know, this is a utilization panel, so I'll talk a little more about the oil field. We're a little more than 50% complete with the drilling program. We're going to end up drilling more than 300 new wells, and we're over 150 at this point. The processes inside the oil field, there's a lot of surface equipment. A lot of people don't realize that when you do a full chain carbon capture to utilization system, and enhanced oil recovery is your utilization, about half the capital of our $1 billion project goes to build out and provide the facilities for the utilization side. Early next year, we'll be bringing on our second central processing facility inside the field. This is more than $100 million facility, so it'll be exciting to see when that happens. The field will really hit its stride on being able to produce all the oil that it has the potential to produce. We just came back online yesterday after about a 3-week outage due to Hurricane Harvey. The oil field was in the path of hurricane force winds, and so we shut down the field according to state regulations, and we shut it down a day early to give our employees time to go deal with their families and prepare for the storm personally. It'll take about a month for production in the field to get back up to its pre-storm levels, which was about 4,000 barrels a day. And that's significant when we're talking about how these kinds of projects contribute to the energy security of the United States. Just in December of last year, we were at 300 barrels per day in this field, and so after only 8 months of injection, we were up to 4,000 barrels per day. So a huge increase in the production. So in this panel, we're focusing on the corporate investment in CO2 utilization and how we can get more of that done. Yesterday's hearing, we focused on the fact that upfront capital is the big deterrent. But there are some other things I'm going to talk about here right quick that we need to also think about. For the Petronova project, utilization was the enhanced oil recovery project. First in the West Ranch oil field, it'll take us about 10 years to fill that field up with all the CO2 that it can take. And so we'll begin our search in a few years for a subsequent oil field after that. And on the Texas coast, we're blessed with plenty of targets. And I'll say that before we came online, I found it difficult to get a hold of the oil field operators along the Gulf Coast. Now that we're online and our results are public, they're calling me. So hopefully that'll go a little smoother this time. But are there other utilizations out there that can take the volume of CO2 that the power industry needs to get rid of and create a revenue stream that would support CCS? That's the question that NRG is really anxious to find out. Enhanced oil recovery, I think that Al's going to talk to us a little bit, is a big enough market to handle the CO2 that this nation needs to put away. But unfortunately, the economics of enhanced oil recovery don't allow the oil industry to pay us enough to justify carbon capture systems. So we either need to find a way to fill the gap with some of the things that the senators were talking about a few minutes ago. 45Q is one of those opportunities. Or we need to find a utilization that can pay more for CO2. So are there markets or combinations of markets that could be big enough to take a meaningful portion of the CO2 and pay a meaningful price for that CO2? To help answer that question, NRG, along with our Canadian partner COSIA, have commissioned Marcius, who will be on a panel a little later, to Marcius with the XPRIZE, sorry. We've commissioned an XPRIZE around carbon to find a utilization that can fill that gap. So as we're moving forward, the real headwinds against CCUS are the costs have to come down to capture CO2. We need more players in the industry to give consumers of technology and of project development like NRG. We need more choices. Mitsubishi is a fine technology, and we would consider that again for future projects. But are there other technologies out there that we can find? And so hopefully through the XPRIZE and through a lot of the research going on at universities and in companies around the world and in the U.S. in particular, we can find those other utilizations that can help bridge the gap. Another thing that we need to do is to regain the confidence of corporate CFOs and the lending community in the fact that we can bring carbon capture systems online, on time, and on budget. I think the Petronova project was a step in that direction, and we look forward to our other industry partners who will be endeavoring into carbon capture I'll challenge them to take care to do the same thing with their projects. Bring them in on time and on budget so that we can have confidence in the capital markets to flow capital into these projects. So with that, I will look forward to questions during the Q&A.
Thanks, David. Next up will be Al Collins, again, Senior Director of Regulatory Affairs at Occidental Petroleum Corporation. Thanks, Al.
Hi, everybody. I want to thank C2ES and the senators for the opportunity to speak at this panel today. What I thought I'd do is tell you a little bit about Occidental and then tell you why we're supporting legislation like the Future Act and how we see things going forward. Occidental is a large international oil and gas company with a chemical division. We're actually the fourth largest U.S. oil and gas company. We do exploration and production in the oil fields. Our operations are in the U.S., Middle East, and South America with 50% domestic and 50% international production. We're also the world's largest user of CO2. We inject over 2.6 billion cubic feet of CO2 per day into our oil reservoirs, and this ultimately recovers 10 to about 25% of the oil that's not otherwise recoverable. So just think about that for a second. Imagine being able to get 10 to 25% more efficiency out of your process by doing EOR. It's truly extraordinary. To give you some context about what this, the scale of our 2.6 billion cubic feet per day, David talked about Petronova, and we inject the emissions from the equivalent of 26 Petronovas per day. So there's a lot of opportunity here in the oil field, and we're just one player in that. We own about 2,000 miles of CO2 pipeline where we move CO2 to the Permian Basin, where we operate in the U.S. to use it for our EOR operations. And let's see, back in 2010, NRDC did a report, which I like directing people to, about the U.S. potential for enhanced oil recovery. And for any of y'all that are interested about the opportunity, You should look at that report. I think it's probably the best or the latest, most comprehensive report I've seen, even though it is 7 years old. But the factor is getting more CO2 to the oil fields to recover more of this oil. So we've been injecting CO2 to enhance our oil recovery for over 4 decades, and it's all been safe. We've had no problems, which is, I think, important. And ultimately, all the CO2 that we inject is sequestered in the reservoir, so we can't recover it, and it can't leak to the atmosphere. So it truly is a valid technology for reducing CO2 emissions. We currently employ a variety of technologies to separate the CO2 from our natural gas streams, and we use membranes, we use different types of fluids. We also use something called the Ryan's Home process. And we're always looking for new opportunities to test new technologies. We work with lots of developers. We field test their technologies, and sometimes we even invest in them, because we think really the key to making everything work is helping perfect the capture technology. And we think we need different capture technologies in different types of situations. So let me get to the point that I wanted to make here today about supplies of CO2. Now, on its face, you might think that we view other uses of CO2 outside the EOR application as competition, but it's just the opposite. We welcome other uses of CO2 because we believe that creating more demand for CO2 will lead to more innovation in the capture technologies, which in turn will lead to better pricing of the CO2, because we'll be able to perfect the technology and bring the cost down, which is what this is all about. And as David mentioned, we aren't there yet. We do think it's critical for things like the Future Act, and in particular the Future Act, to be there to help bridge that gap between the cost of capture and what the market can pay for the CO2. We think as we perfect the technology, the prices of capture are going to come down. We'll get more affordable prices for the CO2, and then that will really incentivize all sorts of uses beyond the EOR application. We also believe that incentives to help build out infrastructure, like more CO2 pipelines, compression, and pumps that are needed to move CO2 where the uses are really critical, so we support those too. And my CEO asked me to make sure that I thanked the senators for their leadership on the Future Act, and I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Al. Next up is Christopher, and Christopher is actually, his company's behind some of the technology we've been talking about here, so Chris, come on up.
All right, well, thank you very much for providing me the opportunity to speak with you all today. Also, thanks to C2ES for hosting this event, and thank you to David and Al for their remarks, and then also for the 4 senators who provided their very encouraging comments about the work that's being done to advance things like the Future Act. Certainly, these are all very important things. My name is Chris Romans. I manage government relations for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries America. And today I'd like to focus my remarks on providing you some of the background of MHI's investment in CO2 capture technology, and also tell you a bit about our record of deployments, and particularly those on coal-fired power plants in the U.S. And then finally, I'll discuss some of our ongoing R&D efforts. MHI first embarked on developing a CO2 capture solution that could be deployed on power generation stations back in the early 90s. At that time, our leadership realized that as the world began to take seriously the threat of climate change and began to come up with measures to deal with that threat, that it would be necessary for there to be a technological solution to deal with those carbon dioxide emissions. And we began to develop a process that could be retrofitted onto existing power plants in order to manage that CO2. The process that we ended up developing is as much evolutionary as it is revolutionary. Amine solutions, which are capable of pulling CO2 out of power plant exhaust, had been around for some time at the time of the early 90s. The innovations that we pursued included engineering a system that could be deployed at an industrial scale and creating an amine with a sufficiently low energy cost and minimal degradation so that the implementation of such a system wouldn't be overly burdensome to a plant operator. Working with Kansai Electric Power Company, we developed the KS1 solvent and used it in a process we call the Kansai Mitsubishi carbon dioxide removal process, which we've trademarked as the KMCDR process. It's also a lot easier to say it that way. Initial testing was done at KEPCO's non-coal facility on natural gas starting in 1991. In 1999, we deployed our first commercial plant separating CO2 from a natural gas boiler. That CO2 was used to enhance urea production. Of the 13 commercial plants that we've delivered, 12 of those have been for the use of either urea or methanol production. And the capacities for those plants have ranged from about 200 to 500 tons per day. Moving towards carbon capture from the power industry, however, would require us to consider how to scale up the technology to significantly larger scales and to consider additional impurities that might be present in coal-fired flue gases. In 2002, we began testing the KS1 solvent on coal gas at our R&D center in Hiroshima. In 2006, we deployed the process on a pilot plant in Matsushima in Kyushu to test the long-term effects of coal-fired flue gas impurities, particularly sulfur dioxide and dust, on the technology. From that pilot test, which we operated for more than 6,000 hours, we worked on developing countermeasures to ensure reliable operation for future commercial plants. Finally, in 2008, we employed a large test absorption tower in Mihara, also near Hiroshima, where MHI is a large manufacturing facility. This facility was constructed to test liquid and gas flows through a rectangular tower which would aid our scale-up efforts. MHI had successfully scaled up flue gas desulfurization plants in much the same manner in the past. Before proceeding further into the history of the technology, I want to give you a bit of an overview about how it works, with a focus on how it's used in a power generation context, since that's the most relevant to our discussion. In a typical configuration, particularly like the one we use at Petronova, flue gas is diverted from the stack following air quality control treatment for things such as sulfur and NOx removal. It then enters an area known as the quencher, where flue gas is cooled to near ambient temperatures. From there, the cooled gas is moved into an absorber tower, the square structure that I just mentioned, where it makes contact with our solvent. The flue gas, now removed of its CO2, is washed and vented into the atmosphere out of the absorber. Once the solvent is saturated with CO2, it's pumped into what we call a regeneration tower, where steam is used to heat the amine and release the CO2 at very high purity. From there, the CO2 is compressed and dried and can be transported for end use. On the two installations we've done in the US, those end uses have been geologic sequestration and then EOR, as David mentioned. The CO2 solvent, which is now, or the amine that is now CO2-free, is then repurposed and reused in the system. During the development of the KMCDR process, markets to sell our technology into for power plants were immature. The regulatory environment in the 90s, much as it is today, is not structured to place a price on CO2. However, we had other commercial opportunities available to us, and in 1999, as mentioned earlier, we delivered a 220-ton-per-day capture system to support urea production in Malaysia. And as I said before, we have 13 total commercial plants to date with a 200 to 500-ton-per-day range. So how about power plants, which is the whole reason we designed the system in the first place? As I said before, since 2002, we've been testing our solvent and process on power plants exhaust in our non-coal facility and other test sites. However, we had lacked an opportunity to scale up. That changed after the Matsushima demonstration when we partnered with Southern Company to build a test facility at the Plant Berry Power Station outside Mobile, Alabama. With Southern, we brought online a 25 megawatt equivalent pilot plant that pulled 500 tons per day. That plant came online in 2011 and operated until 2014, allowing us to accumulate more than 12,000 hours of operational data. At the time, it was the largest pilot plant in the world. While the sequestration of the CO2 from that facility was funded as part of a DOE CCARB program, the money used to actually build the capture system was all private. MHI, Southern, and EPRI all shared in that cost. The installation at Plant Berry resulted in a number of important achievements. Most importantly, we were able to demonstrate that our system could operate at significant scale using actual coal plant flue gas over extended periods of time. But beyond this, we were also able to test and demonstrate a number of things that would help us eventually scale up the system and prove its applicability to different operating conditions. In particular, we were able to measure the effectiveness of the square absorber structure, test energy-saving systems, implement an amine cleaning system, test the control system, and measure performance under different flue gas loads. Following the conclusion of this initial testing, we've partnered with DOE and other organizations to perform additional tests at Plant Barry, including systems to reduce energy use on the CO2 capture. Ultimately, Plant Barry has provided an invaluable reference point for project developers assessing the CO2 capture technology for coal. The work accomplished by the partners at Barry helped ensure the success of the carbon capture system at Petronova. Looking towards the future, we're still continuing to innovate and improve the process. I want to share with you two ongoing efforts that we are internally engaged in. The first is the development of improved solvents that have lower heat consumption, lower amine degradation, and lower amine emissions. One promising solvent that we're working on shows significant improvement in these three areas, and we're currently testing it in Japan and exploring opportunities to engage in larger scale testing here in the US. The second effort is optimizing our process for use on natural gas combined cycle power stations. Our earliest deployments of KM-CDR were on natural gas sources, but adapting the process to NGCC requires adjustments to account for the differences in flue gas from a combined cycle plant and flue gas from either a coal or natural gas boiler. We've been able to successfully reproduce those conditions at our non-coal facility and have found that there's no issue with the increase in oxygen concentration in the flue gas. MHI is not only looking at retrofitting our technology onto the back end of an existing NGCC plant, but using the full capability of our MHI group companies, we also have developed the capability to provide an integrated natural gas combined cycle solution with a CO2 capture system already built in. I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to any questions that you may have during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm going to ask the panel a couple of questions, but I'm also going to move this back a little bit. Can you guys see those people over there? All right. So you probably still won't be able to see me, maybe. So putting that on, first of all, thank you guys. Great presentation. One of the purposes of today's session is obviously to talk about how we're making out with the technology, what's been happening. Some of this was also at the hearing yesterday. But one of the things we know, and what you're hearing here, is that carbon capture works, and it's something that has been going on in the United States for quite a while. We just heard some of the history. What we're really talking about now is how to improve it, how to innovate, and very importantly, how to make it more certain and cost-effective, reduce the cost, and by innovating. And you heard some of the objectives that some of a company like Mitsubishi has in doing that. I think from a global perspective, there's a huge potential global market for these technologies. We are using electric generating and industrial processes around the globe that ultimately are going to need to capture their carbon. And to the extent the United States can be in the forefront, or companies that are doing business in the United States can be in the forefront here, it's going to create a very significant global market. And the obstacles continue to be financing and the ability to deploy more. I think everybody here said this one way or the other. The more we can build, the better we'll get at it. And this is a universal truth. When I was talking to a friend before we started today, while we were having coffee, and when I started in the air pollution control business back in, I'm not saying when, but back in the 70s probably, you know, we were struggling to figure out what to do about two big things: acid rain and nitrogen oxide emissions that cause urban smog. Remember those issues? What we were looking at for on a power plant was low NOx burners. In other words, nitrogen oxide, nitrogen is 80% of the air, so when you put air in there to burn it, the more air you put in there, the more nitrogen you put in there, the more nitrogen oxide you get when you burn. And so if we could just reduce the amount of air going in there when we're burning and still get things to burn, we would produce less. Well, we've gone so much farther than that in the last 40 years, 30 years, to selective catalytic reduction. In the arena of acid rain, we started looking at switching to different kinds of lower sulfur coal. And now we moved to wet scrubbers, which were very expensive. Then we figured out how to make them cheaper. And then we went to selective catalytic reduction. And in both of these cases, we're approaching 98, 97% reduction in these emissions from various plants. And so if you think of that kind of innovation and sequence, there's no reason to believe that once we start building more of these, that we're not going to be able to start to innovate, find different solvents, find different ways to do it. But money is always one of the big things that helps make this machine go. Necessity is another one, and policy. I know that this is shocking, but policy can help. And so one of my first questions to the panel, I'm going to ask each one of you to opine on this, is what when you look at the federal and state level, because a lot of things go on at both of these levels, what policies do you think might be helpful in terms of both the financing side and also moving forward on making investments? Can you, for carbon capture and use? And I think we'll just go in the same order you went in when I asked you to come up. So David, that means you're first.
Okay, well, I did. There it is. Okay, so I'll kind of take your question in reverse order. I want to thank the state of Texas, who had, back in 2009, passed a number of clean coal, clean carbon incentives. We estimate that the economic impact on our project of the Texas incentives was over $100 million. So I'd like to thank everyone in Texas that worked so hard on getting those things passed, and it shows that despite the image that's out there sometimes, we do care about the environment, and we care deeply about it in Texas, and we're putting our money where our mouth is. The technology needs to move forward. The cost of the Petronova system, being a first of a kind, was very high. I hope that our friends at Mitsubishi are working hard on finding a way to get the cost down. So was that responsive to your question?
I think so.
All right.
Yes, for sure. Policy-wise, so.
Policy-wise?
Texas obviously is innovating in many different ways, from renewables to even encouraging carbon capture. But are there policies that would help, and this is sort of tied in maybe, Christopher, David, to the reasons the company even made a decision to invest in this to begin with?
Sure. Well, NRG embarked on this venture called Petronova back in 2009, mostly in response to the fact that a large part of our corporate profits came from burning coal and selling it as electricity. And if we were going to continue to be able to do that in a low-carbon economy, a low-carbon society that was coming, we needed to find a way to decarbonize. And so that was the genesis of this project: find a way to lower the carbon emissions of our coal-fired fleet and do it in a way that did not increase the cost of electricity. And so we were able to do that in Texas, blessed by local policies, incentives, the federal DOE grant, but also the fact that we had good geography. We had plenty of oil fields to look at. I will say that during the permitting process, this was back in 2010, 2011 timeframe. As you know, the Texas Environmental Agency and US EPA were not the best of friends at that time. However, they both laid aside their differences for the purposes of figuring out how to structure a first-of-a-kind permit. This had never been done before at this scale, and there were a lot of issues. The plant is located in the Houston-Galveston non-attainment zone, so there were a lot of challenges around not just carbon, but the whole spectrum of emissions, because the Houston airshed is so heavily used by industry. So I would say that if you're looking at doing this in other jurisdictions, come talk to us. I am certain that the air regulators in Texas would be glad to talk to other states about how we got it done.
Yeah, well, I think those are pretty important points. Al?
One more time. There it is.
Okay,
Tap it. You're good.
okay, thanks. Oxy's role in this is really as a consumer of CO2. So the price of CO2 is really important to us, just like the price of electricity is really important to us. So the incentives that we're talking about are more on the capture side, which we think is appropriate. We think we'll get secondary benefits from that by bringing down the price and increasing the supply, which will help on the demand side of the equation where we sit. So clearly 45Q is incredibly attractive to us, but especially at the new levels that are in the Future Act, because what we keep on hearing back from a lot of developers is that in order to get financing for the type of projects we'd like to see happen, they really need a substantial benefit in the $35, $50 range is what we're hearing back from them as what is necessary. So we view the Future Act as absolutely critical for any of this going forward. I just can't be more clear about that. We also think other incentives that help build out the infrastructure for moving CO2, which I mentioned are really important, including CO2 pipelines and the infrastructure legislation that's going to come forward. Favorable tax treatments like depreciation would be attractive. Things like the treatment of MLPs may be helpful, private activity bonds, all of these types of things that offer a suite of different financing options or help make financing more reality is really, really critical. I'll hearken back to something David said about Texas. Texas has some very interesting incentives for oil companies like Oxy, which is a severance tax reduction on anthropogenic CO2 that's used for enhanced oil recovery and subsequently sequestered. So it's a little bit different than 45Q. It accomplishes the same objective, but from kind of the demand side versus the supply side. So we think that's a nice complement, for what for the Future Act. Senator Heitkamp mentioned Brad Crabtree. He's been leading a group that put together a report on for Governor Meade and Governor Bullock on state incentives, and some of the states have done some really, really innovative things. Wyoming comes to mind, where they laid out pipeline corridors throughout their state and did some pre-permitting of those. So they looked at NEPA and potential ESA issues. And if you want to go to Wyoming and build a pipeline, they're already laid out and you can just pay a fee for building there. For companies like Oxy that occasionally build pipelines, those types of permitting issues are kind of the big unknown as we develop projects. So if that's the uncertainty is taken away from the equation, then we know how long it takes to build, we know how much it costs. It's the permitting issues that are not as well defined. So that type of approach is incredibly attractive, I think, to us and many other companies. So I encourage you to look at that report, putting together the pieces. Is that the,
Great Plains.
Great Plains. Really great report. But I'll come back to the Future Act. I cannot emphasize enough how important we think this is to making all of these aspirations go forward.
Thanks.
Okay.
Christopher.
Yeah, I think it's working. I completely agree with what David and Al said. In terms of for us, obviously, we were incentivized by different factors to create our particular process. But to more answer your question, I think what's important for state and federal policies to do is to give CO2 some kind of value. And once it has some kind of value, then the investment case becomes a lot clearer. Certainly the Future Act is very significant in getting us there because it does raise the value of the CO2 and makes it more attractive for potential project developers. The other important thing that the Future Act does, I think, that cannot be ignored is that it makes the tax credit permanent, right? It's not capped at 75 million tons like the existing 45Q is. So that creates it lets the value be realized over a longer period of time. But really creating making CO2 a more tangible commodity, I think is going to be very helpful in helping utilities and other project developers, make a decision on wanting to capture CO2 and do something with it.
So, Christopher, what were some of the business rationales in Mitsubishi to decide to really push forward on these technologies?
Well, there's kind of a thread of thought throughout MHI. Obviously, we're a company that seeks to create profit and value for its shareholders. And we did see in the early 90s that we had the potential to move into a direction where the need to regulate CO2 emissions would necessitate some sort of a technology to put on it. But beyond that, MHI tends to look at the things it makes, not just in terms of being able to deliver a profitable product, a good product, but also we look at how we can be good environmental stewards. So if you look at everything that we make, whether it's the capture system, whether it's our high-efficiency gas turbines, whether it's the high-efficiency boilers that we do, or even aircraft that we make, everything is done to sort of minimize the environmental impact. We look at how we can create things that are valuable and necessary for society, but also minimize that impact. And some of that is just, there's sort of a Japaneseness of that. Japan is a country of very limited resources, so we have to be very mindful and thoughtful about how we use those resources, and also just a certain recognition that we need to also be a sustainable partner with the planet as we continue to build and innovate for our customers, even if particularly within the fossil space. So I think that's kind of the combination of things that led our leadership back in the early 90s to embark on this journey.
So before I turn over to get some questions from the audience, I'd like maybe each of you to sort of give your sense of where you think the most promising areas for improvement are. We've all talked about one of the ideas here was to build more and deploy more. As we do that, we will learn more, and I gave the examples of nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide. But where do you see the promising areas here based on the experience of actually getting a project done, the work your company does, what you guys are seeing, and what you need for CO2 coming at you? Well, why don't we just go down the way this way, starting with you, Al.
Well, we've looked at, let me see, without revealing anything confidential, how can I say this? We are looking at all sorts of opportunities. By opportunities, I mean we're looking at large sources of CO2 that are located near and areas that would be favorable for operations, and thinking about how a project could be developed, and the specific technologies. And I wish I could speak more to this, but I really can't. But I can tell you that I mentioned in my comments earlier, we think a variety of technologies are needed, because we think there's going to be all sorts of applications. We shouldn't look just at these really large sources, but we should look at where smaller sources are clustered together, which may take other types of technologies. So we spend a significant amount of time. We have a whole team of engineers that look at different technologies, that reach out to companies reach out to us. We, like I said, field test them. Sometimes we invest in them. But we think that's really where things are going to happen. And I'll get back to the importance of the Future Act. We also are excited about other applications of CO2 beyond EOR, because we think creating that demand, especially in areas that are where CO2 is not really used for EOR, so other parts of the country which aren't served by a good pipeline system like we have in the Permian and New Mexico, Colorado, are really, really critical. And we're excited about that, and we do keep very much on those technologies and applications. Lastly, I'll say Oxy has a very large chemical division. We're in the top 3 of every product that we make. And we believe there are opportunities that would have synergy with what OxyChem does and large affordable supplies of CO2. And we think we can connect that with large affordable supplies of electricity. And anyway, magic happens.
So there, I think you're alluding to the fact that in addition to EOR or even geologic sequestration, an area worth looking at is CO2 as a feedstock for other processes.
Absolutely. We need to think in a very long horizon about this, and CO2 as a commodity, which people have talked about for a long time, but a commodity beyond its current uses.
Yeah.
Well,
David?
well said, Al, and just a couple of examples of what Al's point. Marcus is going to talk to us a little bit later about some of the innovations they're seeing at the XPRIZE around carbon utilization. On the carbon capture side, we're a large generator in California. There are no coal plants in California, and yet the state continues to have one of the most aggressive decarbonization of its electric grid programs in the world. So other technologies that can capture CO2 from gas-fired generation is definitely on our radar, and we're looking for opportunities to deploy that in California and other regions that have abandoned coal.
So that's an interesting point, and it's a good lead-in, Christopher, to you. I mean, are you guys looking at technologies that may be adjusted from a coal capture process to natural gas flue gas?
Well, as I mentioned before, our process can work on coal, or it can work on natural gas combined cycle, or on a natural gas boiler. And as I did mention, we have done some testing on how to apply our technology to the different operating conditions that occur in natural gas flue gas, and we're confident in our ability to deploy it on an NGCC station, whether on the back end or whether as part of an integrated solution. And so, if states or the federal government looking for ways to show that that's possible, certainly we see that as very very promising. We're very confident in our ability to deliver that kind of a product to a customer. And as I also said, we're looking at just how do we improve our solvent? How do we make our amine use less energy, degrade less, have lower emissions? We think we have a very good product now, but how do we make it even better? So those are the main areas of our current R&D efforts. We're doing other things as well, but that for us is what we're most interested in. So I mean, a chance to do some work on an actual natural gas power plant in the U.S. would certainly be most welcome for us.
Yeah. Well, I think you brought up an important point with natural gas-fired boilers or even natural gas-fired heaters in industrial processes, because one of the largest sources of CO2 in the United States after transportation and power generation is industrial sources, and a lot of those, there's some inherent in the processes of whether it's a chemical plant or others, but there's a lot of it is due to the heating of water to be used in the industrial processes, or the heating of the air to be used in industrial processes. So it's an important area.
And as I mentioned as well, of the 13 plants we've delivered, 12 of them are industrial plants.
Yeah.
So it definitely can be done.
Okay, so I'm going to get to the podium here so I can see everyone, and we'll do a little bit of questions, and I'm going to say answers from the audience. So you guys are going to be responsible for that part. All right, show of hands. Well, 1, 2, and then 3 are in line there. I'm not going to get everybody's name, but just remember you're in line.
Hi, I'm Mike Godek with Advanced Resources. I'd like to follow up a little bit on that first question about the role of government and ask a little bit more about its role on the technology development side. Clearly, all of you have taken advantage of government investment in technology development to get to where we are now. Is there a continued role of government? Should investment in research and development be a priority of this Congress and of others to continue down this road of bringing more efficiency, more cost effectiveness, and more options to the field? Is that something that a role that government should play?
I'll take a first stab at it. So I personally believe that industry will get there eventually. I think the role that government can play is to accelerate that. Mitsubishi is already on its own working on improvements to the process that I bought. I get contacted weekly by someone who has another technology, another idea, and they're looking for someone to help them take that next step. Eventually, if it's a good idea, they'll find funding. What the government role does is help those folks shorten that process to get funding and get proven.
Okay. To answer your question, I would say yes, the government does have a role, and I'll answer it in kind of two prongs. As David said, the government can accelerate what a private company like ours can do to get the technology to a later stage. And even for a process like ours, which is very mature and commercially available, different types of R&D work that the government may fund can be of assistance to us. So, for example, in the last administration, which you heard a lot of from DOE, was let's try to get more opportunities to do work on natural gas plants, for example, or industrial plants. Any opportunities to do a little bit of extra work with the government's help to demonstrate that is certainly something that we welcome. We'll keep doing the work anyway, but as David said, the government partnering with the government can really help make that process move faster. One of the other things, and this is actually, I don't think David said this today, but he did say it at a hearing a while back, is that it's not just a question of the government providing funding opportunities, it's when does the government provide funding? Because one of the things that helped us with Petronova was the timing of the funding. And so it's not just a question of providing funding, it's where that funding is available. Because there's certain parts in project development that are riskier than others, and where government support can really help get it to the right place. So that's a long way of saying yes.
And I'll just add real quickly that it's Occidental's position that government does have a role in this. We've got a long history of funding research and also helping projects come to fruition. It's not a partisan issue, it's an American issue. And we believe the U.S. is a leader in this, and if we want to maintain the leadership, then we need to maintain the funding to help support the technology and the innovation.
Thanks. I think the next question was back there.
Check. My name is John Noel. I work for Clean Water Action. I do oil and gas policy. So there's another school of thought here that increasing the tax credits under 45Q may not create this carbon utilization market, but instead immediately incentivize oil production on the taxpayer's dime. And so respectfully, there's a reason why Occidental Petroleum says 45Q is incredibly attractive, but members of communities who live near enhanced oil recovery operations aren't here, as far as I know. So the question is there a way to address climate change with carbon capture sequestration without incentivizing the industry who is causing climate change? Thanks.
I appreciate your question, and I will refer you to a report that the International Energy Agency did about the carbon footprint, the life cycle carbon footprint of a barrel of oil that's produced using anthropogenic CO2 versus a conventional barrel. And I think the report speaks for itself, and I think the Clean Air Task Force actually translated that report into a more understandable format, at least for people who are like me, that are not as smart as the people at IEA. But I think it's a path forward. And if you're concerned about the carbon footprint of oil, I'd refer you to look at that and then kind of assess how you see EOR using anthropogenic CO2 fitting into this whole puzzle. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I think we have a great relationship with the communities that we operate in, and I'm proud of that. So,
Any other folks want to chime in here? You know, I think this is an important issue because obviously if you're, just, it's not necessarily an elephant in the room, but you're using enhanced oil recovery to take more hydrocarbons out of the ground, you're going to use them. There's a demand for those. There's a demand that has to be dealt with as much as whether you're producing it or not. So there's a complex issue. There's also an issue of how do you finance an EOR, which we know, how you're going to finance carbon capture, which we know we need going into the future because there's going to be a need for it in the industrial processes and in power generation, as we've heard. And right now, the most economical way to do it is with getting a price for the carbon. Everybody has said if there was a price on carbon, that might make it a different thing. So I think it's the other thing that's in this bill, which I think is pretty important, is it does require a look at the life cycle of what would happen. And so there'll be some review of that. It won't just be a willy-nilly kind of, if you're doing carbon capture, you can just avail yourself to this. There'll have to be some life cycle carbon. But the issue is an important one, and it is, on the face of it, paradoxical in a certain sense in the near term. But if we look at the long term, I think that's what we got to keep our eye on. How do we get from where we are now to that future state? I guess I could say one last thing about this. Getting more oil out of an existing oil well rather than drilling a new one sometimes also has other land use benefits. But again, that's not going to help the people who are living next to the existing one. I think the next question was over here. And then the fourth one was going to be over there.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Madhav Acharya with ARPA-E. For the gentleman in Mitsubishi, one of the earliest programs we funded actually was on carbon capture, so it's a good example of government funding research. A question for you about the cost of carbon capture. I don't know if you can share your estimate of the cost per ton from your unit. And in terms of reducing that, do you see a role also for example, modularization to dramatically lower the cost of construction and installation of these units?
Appreciate the question. I don't think I can share publicly some of the operational costs of our capture system. We certainly are very interested, though, in finding different ways to bring down the cost of capture. I did mention a couple things, such as the research we did with DOE on using less heat, obviously the advanced solvents. But also, one of the things that we think is that as we continue to build more projects at scale, Petronova scale, we will be able to bring innovations to the manufacturing process and the construction process and how we deliver a contract, which we hope will realize cost savings in the future. Beyond that, I would give it to David.
So because of intellectual property, there's a lot of things that are proprietary. However, we did receive a $190 million DOE grant, public funds, and under the obligations of that grant, we will be writing reports that will become public that will provide almost everything that you're looking for, if not all. And I think the first of those reports is probably due out before the end of this year. So cost to build, cost to operate, those kinds of things will be in that report.
Al, do you have anything on that?
Because of antitrust issues, I can't ever discuss pricing, so I'm going to make a loud exit if we do, okay?
Okay, the next, Brad, you want to say something? But there's a person in line over here, but we'll We got time.
I
for it.
just wanted to add one quick point on the question that was raised
Yes.
before.
Yes.
Because it gets very little attention in context of enhanced oil recovery and in the geologic sequestration that occurs through that activity. The report that was referenced, the net life cycle emissions reductions from the process in the IEA analysis is 37%.
Right.
Those are enormous emissions reductions. The other thing that gets often ignored is that oil produced through enhanced oil recovery typically is light sweet crude, and it's displacing more carbon intensive, heavier crudes that we're importing. The United States still imports an enormous amount of oil. A lot of it's imported from countries that have a much lower level of regulation than we do. So I think that's another aspect that's often forgotten.
Thanks, Brad. Over here in the back row.
My name is Irving Minzer. I'm a professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies here. And my question's for Al. Al, you mentioned that Oxy has more than 30 years of successful experience in sequestering CO2 in EOR applications. Could you expand a little bit on that and tell us a little bit about the method that Oxy uses to monitor fugitive emissions or emissions that are associated with the recycling and repressurization of the fields? And also say a little bit about if you have any plans for building on that experience in the future as you expand the use of CO2 for EOR.
You know, I appreciate you asking that question because Occidental was the first company to have a plan approved by the U.S. government to quantify the amount of CO2 that's sequestered in the course of EOR. And that's available on EPA's website. If you Google Denver Unit MRV plan, the complete plan is on EPA's website, as well as the deliberations that went into developing that plan with the agency. So what that plan does is it explains how we're going to quantify the amount of CO2, which would mean how we're going to address leaks, fugitive emissions, if we have a well blowout, how we will estimate that. So I think it gives a lot of integrity to the question of, you know, I think most people agree geologic sequestration is safe and pretty well accepted. Not everyone, but I think most folks do. The question is, how do you know, what you really store? And I think that plan gets at it. Because we had another plan approved, a much bigger plan that has a very, very long life at Hobbs, New Mexico, and which actually encompasses 2 reservoirs that are geologically connected. I think that speaks to Oxy's vision, plan, future, that we're available to accept your anthropogenic CO2, and if there are reasons for you needing a quantification and certification that the CO2 is sequestered, we can offer that service. And one thing I'm really proud of with these plans is that they really rely heavily on the current operation of our reservoirs, so they don't require a lot of other techniques beyond a modest amount of record keeping and reporting than what we do. That means we can offer this service at a very low cost. Because we have an injection rate that's equal to a withdrawal rate, pressurization issues are not really a concern. That's how most EOR operations are done. That's addressed in the plan, and I hope that answered your question, but I encourage you to go there and look at it if you haven't seen it.
We've got one here. If somebody was also in line here with their hand, I don't remember, so raise your hand again if you want to.
Hi, this is just a general question for any of the panelists. I think a common thread among most of the speakers today was that we're looking for a price for carbon. I was just wondering if you could speak to what a tentative price for the carbon might be, and what kind of considerations go into the price for carbon.
Okay, well, I'll start. The Future Act proposes, I think, somewhere close to $30 per ton for enhanced oil recovery operations. And based on my now limited 8-month knowledge of operating a integrated carbon capture with enhanced oil recovery project, I can believe that more projects will be built with that kind of incentive. I think you'll see several other projects that are currently being considered but not really advancing because the economics are so challenging. Once the Future Act is law, I think those projects will immediately go into development and construction.
Anybody bidding higher, 40, lower, 20? What do we hear up here on the panel? You want me to talk faster so it sounds like an auction? Come on.
I'll just, I can't, Oxy hasn't taken a position on carbon tax or whatever, and we won't until there's a piece of legislation that we can evaluate. But I will say what we understand from developers is that the $35 level is about the right incentive that they need in order to get financing for their projects. And because we want to see more of these projects going forward, then that's why we support that piece of legislation.
I don't have too much to add, but I will echo Al's comments for much the same reason. We're hearing similar things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a school of thought that almost any price will help move people thinking about reducing the amount of carbon emissions we have in the United States. But I want to make sure everybody in the audience who wants to ask this panel a question has a chance to before I close this panel out. I think we have one in the back room there, Manjo. Not the back room, the back wall, or the back window.
I just moved back here so you could see me more easily. Dean Scott with Bloomberg BNA. My question is, could you help us with a little bit of a distinction between the way in which the Q45 incentives will drive a certain number of projects forward in your estimation? But it sounds like from a lot of the reports and studies that have done on this, you need this carbon price, to sort of what Senator Whitehouse said, a true carbon price on the economy to really have widespread deployment. So what kind of deployment do we get with these types of Future Act incentives versus 10, 12, 5, some number of operations where we would need a true carbon price to get deployment beyond that?
Well, I'll go first. I'm really not a policy guy. You tell me what the policy is, and I'll find a way to make a project happen. So that's, I'm off the hook now. I don't have to answer that.
But David, we definitely appreciate your willingness to always go first.
Exactly.
Anyone else here?
And I'll repeat my other answer. Oxy is, we would be the purchaser of CO2. So we're on the demand side of it. But what we hear from the folks developing capture projects is that the level in Senator Heitkamp's bill, the Future Act, is the right level in order for them to get financing for their project. They don't get financing, none of these projects will help or will happen. And we talk to a lot of developers. So I feel confident that this is going to be a game changer if it goes forward as far as developing capture projects, which I think most people want.
I'll just add here, and Brad, where did Brad go? You may want to add something here too, but the idea that 45Q doesn't specifically say it's only for enhanced oil recovery. One of the reasons enhanced oil recovery is so attractive right now is for some of the reasons we've already talked to, and it does have a modest but not insignificant net benefit. But ultimately, we want to see other things using carbon capture, and the thing you have in enhanced oil recovery that you don't have on other projects is some revenue stream, whereas with this bill, there'll be some revenue even for other kinds of projects. So people who might want to start thinking about it in terms of changing their own corporate culture, in terms of what kind of emissions they have in an industrial setting, maybe not in an electric generating or oil extraction setting, begin to have a different kind of financial thing, a financial picture to analyze. It's not quite the same as a economy-wide price on carbon, which you hear, or a congressionally enacted price on carbon, but it does incentivize with a value on the carbon that could be captured and used for something. And here, the other thing that we think is important in the Act is the used for something is broadly defined. That's my word, it's not in the Act. But the idea that people will be incentivized to think about, well, what uses can we make of this carbon? We know that EOR is going to be economical, it's going to be more economical here, so there will be more projects built, we'll learn how to do this technology better. But the idea, are there other uses, and does this incentivize other uses? And that, we have high aspirations that it will also incentivize other uses. We don't, or exploration and investment in trying to determine them. So I think it's, for me, it would be too early to tell how much of that will actually happen. But I think we're hoping that not just EOR projects, but many other kinds of projects will be incentivized. Brad, do you want to add anything to what I just said on that?
Now it's working. It wasn't, sorry. So I think there's a distinction also to be made between projects in the power sector and some industrial facilities where the technology has not yet been commercially demonstrated. Those projects tend to cost more. And the 45Q tax credit will have a relatively smaller impact in terms of closing that cost gap. And then there are a variety of industrial facilities for which the costs of CO2 capture are much lower. And for example, at an ethanol plant, the CO2 off of fermentation, or a fertilizer plant, you may see a case where, for example, under the Senate version of the bill, the $50 a ton offered could be enough to allow a facility to capture the CO2 and have that CO2 stored in a saline formation. With the power sector and some other industrial sectors, it's going to require also that EOR revenue to make those commercial projects work. As far as how many projects, I guess, agree with others that that's to be determined. Certainly 45Q will help some projects move forward in the power sector on their own. But in most cases, there'll need to be state and other federal complementary policies, I think, as a general matter.
Okay, I have a hand over here. So we had one on the back wall, and then second row up, and then the waving one over here.
John Wood with the Energy Blue Project. David, I'll excuse you on this. This is a policy question, but understanding the economics, the price on carbon can help drive all this. Looking at the policy outlook and the current political landscape, is it not true that absent positive incentives like 45Q, we are not going to move forward in driving further progress in reducing CO2 emissions, that we're not going to get a carbon tax in the next however many years? But incentives like this are what, in fact, and other positive incentives are what will, in fact, move us forward. Would you agree?
I never like to say anything absolute, but so I'm going to couch it in, where are we going to get faster? And I think clearly, I don't want to discount American ingenuity and innovation, because it seems like the most extraordinary things happen when you're least expecting them. But at the same time, I think these extraordinary things are going to be much more likely to happen with things like the Future Act. In fact, I feel a lot more confident about their imminence with the Future Act than without it.
Anybody want to add?
Well, I agree with Al that the Future Act could be very significant in getting projects built. But one thing that I think Al has said particularly is that the Future Act isn't the only thing that's going to get projects built, and Brad just said the same thing too. It's a very significant and important tool to help move things in the correct direction, but we can't forget that there are other policies that are also going to be needed. I think we mentioned master limited partnerships and private activity bonds. Those are significant as well. Those will also help. And then also the same, things like they're doing in Texas and things that they're doing in other states will also help. Every project developer has a unique set of circumstances that, may require different policy approaches to make it successful. But that's not to discount the importance of the Future Act. It's very significant and the most promising thing that we're looking at right now. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much. My name is Janet Redman. I'm with Oil Change International. My question is around the cost of abatement. We've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations on the 45Q, the EOR side of the 45Q tax credit, and it looks to us like it would cost hundreds of dollars per ton of CO2. Billions per year would be the cost to the taxpayer of this tax credit just on the EOR side. I guess my question is, when there are cheaper alternatives, PTC, ITC, that are unfortunately going away, that would move us to cleaner energy for a cheaper abatement price, why should we be incentivizing the oil industry when we know we need to be moving off of fossil fuels beyond just moving off of coal and sinking CO2 from coal plants? Why should we be paying a more expensive abatement cost when there are other alternatives out there?
I'll point out what I did already. This 45Q is for the folks that capture the CO2. It's a tax credit per ton for CO2 that is captured and geologically sequestered. So EOR is not the only use for that. As Bob pointed out, currently EOR may be the only use that's willing to generate a revenue stream for that. So you couple what EOR pays plus the tax incentive, but it's not for the oil industry. It's for the folks developing the capture projects and subsequently geologically sequestering their CO2 emissions.
Another point that I think is relevant is that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with the climate discussion. At MHI, we're kind of an all-of-the-above energy company. We make fossil plants, we make wind, we make batteries, we used to make solar, but it's all part of a much larger pie. So you mentioned ITC, PTC. Those are also important. They're important pieces of a much larger toolbox that are going to help deal with the climate issue that we're observing. But CO2 is essential, and there are numerous reports that I think we can cite. Clean Air Task Force, I think, has done some good work in this area that say that we'll never be able to reach the climate goals that we've set for ourselves without meaningful carbon capture. It's an essential piece, along with wind, along with solar, along with all kinds of other innovations that everyone's working very hard to bring to fruition to help deal with the challenges that we face. So we need to give ourselves every possible means of being successful.
All right.
Julio Friedmann, hi. I wanted to also just
hit it to make it work.
Yes, exactly. It's like my refrigerator. I wanted to comment on your question a bit. First of all, ditto to everything Chris just said. There's no bad way to reduce emissions. Second, the price of the ITC and the PTC in terms of carbon abatement, depending on what market you're in, ranges from $60 to $120 a ton in the United States. That's noble and that's worth doing. But if the goal is carbon, then we're actually asking for less money than that, which is worth knowing. The third thing that I would go to, and I don't think there's really a polite way to say this, I have to reject the notion that paying people to reduce carbon dioxide emissions is somehow an incentive or a subsidy to oil and gas companies or coal companies. You're not paying them to make more coal or to make more oil, you're actually paying them to reduce emissions. It's a paying for performance. It's like a production tax credit. And if the goal is carbon, that's, I think, certainly worth having on the board, certainly worth considering, and certainly worth acting on. It should be part of an all-of-the-above mix.
All right. Here I thought we were going to have extra time, but we're moving along. So I think that Julio's going to be a panelist on the next panelist, so we sort of give him a little bit of extra jumping in the line there. But I want to make sure everybody who gets their hands up gets a chance.
Good morning. My name is Anna Spirigaeva, and I'm at the National Academy of Sciences. And I'm leading two studies. One is directly related to carbon utilization, and the second is to it has a piece of carbon capture. So I heard from the panelists that industry is interested in other ways to utilize CO2 other than enhanced oil recovery. So I wanted to throw the question back to you. Have you looked at any technologies that industry might be potentially interested in? And if yes, what are they? Thank you.
All right.
David, you're the designated going first guy. Man.
Absolutely. We in building the Petronova project, had to do a lot of things that are unnatural for power companies to do. Most in particular, we had to buy an oil field to capture enough of the value chain to fill in the gap that even the DOE grant didn't provide for us. And so we are desperately looking for other ways to be a seller of CO2. We'd love for other technologies to be out there so that would pay enough to close the gap. For that reason, we're a co-sponsor of the Carbon XPRIZE. You're going to hear more about that in just a minute. We're very excited about some of the ideas and some of the technologies that are participating in that process, building materials, food-grade protein. There's just a lot of things, liquid fuels. Marcus will go through the full list in just a minute. So yes, we're looking at those. We would love for those technologies, and as a co-sponsor, we're putting significant dollars into that effort to find that next technology.
Okay. Are there any more hands?
Yes, Robert Lanza from ICF. You mentioned that the state of Texas provided incentives for the Petronova project. With today's discussion of the Future Act and 45Q, what do you think state governments should be doing, and what state governments are doing now to help this process along in addition to the federal efforts?
Well, at any point where a state touches a carbon capture project, there's an opportunity for them to do something, whether it's regulation, whether it's local ordinances, it's oil and gas rules around, since enhanced oil recovery is the only large volume user of CO2 out of these projects right now. And so the state of Texas actually passed a suite of incentives that addressed all those things. Probably the most significant of which was property tax. The state decided that a carbon capture system for the purposes of the revenue code would be considered a pollution control device and therefore exempt from property taxes. So that was a big incentive for us, and it certainly made a difference in whether we were able to move forward with the project or not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yes, once again, double up here. This will be the last, well, it probably won't be the last question, but we'll see. Go. Back there, Manjo. Back row.
Sorry. Again, I'm John Noel with Clean Water Action. To bring it down to the local level, the state and federal programs that regulate enhanced oil recovery are underfunded and understaffed. So I was wondering if the folks that are pushing the 45Q bill have talked to some of these regulators at all levels and make sure that they're equipped to protect communities from a potential expansion of EOR as a result of this bill.
I think that's a good question. I think EOR obviously is looking at enhancing the recovery of an existing oil well, but and we do expect there'll be some incentivizing of that from this bill, as you point out, but we hope that all these other things we've been talking about will be incentivized as well. I'm going to ask if any of my partners on the Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative want to mention anything about community thoughts on this other than myself, or if anybody on the panel, obviously. I think that was a question beyond the panel, but I think it's an important question. And at C2ES, as a separate matter, we spend a lot of time working with the state environmental regulators who I think are correctly identified as being financially under duress. And I believe this is a ubiquitous problem we have in the environmental management of environmental protection in the country. So I think it's a point well taken. I don't know whether this will be more of a burden than many of the other things that they're dealing with, but it's worth you bringing it up and for us to pursue it. I'm going to have to stop here now so we can get ready for the next panel. I want to thank the panelists for their input here and for the success they've had in working. I want to say a couple of contextual things, and then we'll do a transition type break here. First is, I think one of the more important things, other than thinking of the specifics here, is to always keep this in a larger context. And I think you heard from the senators when they were here this morning, they come at this from very different directions, but for a unified purpose of moving the country forward on some of the large problems we have to solve. Every objective look into the middle of the century and later in the century on what we need to do to decarbonize our economy includes capturing carbon from industrial processes that can't change, that they're still going to exist, from maybe there's too much carbon in the air and we've got to pull it out, from some of the electrification that is still, some of the electric generation that's still going to be going on from either coal or natural gas in the middle of the century. That may or may not be reduced depending on what goes on, but we're going to need to capture the carbon from it. So there's a number of things that every study that has been looked at, including the Obama administration's mid-century strategy, that we need more of in the middle of the century. More renewables and more carbon capture are part of that, and more electrification of industrial buildings and transportation. You put those things together, that's the secret sauce to decarbonize our economy. And of course, a price on carbon will make that happen faster. 45Q will be a step in that direction to help incentivize some of the important technologies that will be needed in that future. So I want to thank the panel for their personal and company's success in moving on some of these items and for their sharing their thoughts with the group today. Thanks again. Thank you.
We're starting the next session. Thank you so much for your time.
Laura? That's good.
Yeah.
You didn't even need a mic. Okay, folks. So we had a pretty exciting and very interesting last session, didn't we? Thinking about how companies are actually investing, not just talking about these technologies, but actually investing, putting real money, putting projects on the ground. I love that. And we also heard from the senators, we heard about the Future Act, and at this point, I want to tell you about a new bill, a bill that's also on this topic. And where's Brad? Hey, Brad, come on up here for a minute. Why don't you tell him about it? So this is our partner, Brad Crabtree. You've heard about him before. Brad, you want to say a little something about this bill?
Thanks, Janet. Good morning, everyone. Last night and announced this morning, Congressman Mike Conaway of Texas, representing the Midland-Odessa area, which is, by the way, the region where the most amount of geologic storage of CO2 occurs in the world today, introduced what's called the Carbon Capture Act. And it was introduced with 29 co-sponsors, 20 Republicans and 9 Democrats. And it is, I think, fair to say, a companion bill of the Future Act. There are some modest differences, but they are not differences of ideology or purpose, just things like eligibility of facilities, different levels, a difference in some of the values for the tax credit and in how long you can claim the credit. But they are very much designed to work together and to have both the Senate and the House moving towards common legislation this year. And Mr. Conaway issued a press release this morning, and there's 100 copies on the table as where you came in, so feel free to take a copy with you. And there are also attached to that quotes of support from many different companies, unions, and NGOs that have been supporting this bill. So it's very exciting. With that hearing yesterday, this great event today with the 4 senators and the great representatives, and now this bill being introduced in the House, we have a lot of momentum. So thank you.
Thanks, Brad. So I just jumped up to the podium, and you probably thought this random woman is taking over. I'm Janet Peace. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Business Strategy at C2ES. And if you can't tell already, we are very optimistic about carbon capture, use, and storage, and we think it's essential, as Bob said, to deal with our climate change challenge in the long run. So the last panel, we were talking about projects on the ground being invested in, and on this next panel, we're going to talk about next generation technologies. Together with the technologies you heard about in the previous panel and the new technologies you're going to hear about, we think these really have a potential to change the game about how we think about carbon. You know, we have to really expand our thinking on this topic from CO2 being a waste product to CO2 being a commodity. You know, using this technology, whether it's for enhanced oil recovery or for other products, really does help offset the costs of capture. And making these cheaper helps us do more sooner. So all of the technologies you're going to hear about on this panel are cutting edge, and we're really happy to be able to provide this platform to talk about those. You know, our goal with this event is really to change the discussion, to bring hey, there is a lot of cool innovation in the carbon capture, use, and storage. There's a lot actually happening. You've heard about a couple bills. We have a Senate bill, we have a House bill, and we actually have a lot of companies who are thinking very seriously about how to deploy carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing this next panel. You have their bios. I'm just going to do quick introductions, and then I'm going to turn it over. So our first speaker is Laura Nereng. She's a sustainability leader for the electronics and energy business at 3M, and she's going to tell us about their research in converting CO2 into a fuel. After Laura, we're going to hear from Dr. Marcius Extavour. He's the director for energy at the NRG COSIA carbon XPRIZE. You heard mention of the XPRIZE in the last panel. He's going to tell us about some of the cool technologies that those teams are actually trying to develop. And then after Marcus, we're going to hear from Bill Brown, who's the CEO of Net Power, and Bill's going to talk about a very promising alum cycle technology. We're very excited about that one. And then finally, Dr. Julio Friedmann, he's the CEO of Carbon Wrangler, and we've invited him to talk about some of the work going on at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where he used to work, and to share some of his thoughts on the next generation of technologies in this space. With that, how about if I hand it over to you, Laura?
Well, good morning. Thank you for all for being here, and thank you for C2ES for having me here to give this maybe additional diversity of thought to the mix here. My name is Laura Nereng, and I have the privilege of working with a terrific team of R&D people at my company back in Minnesota at 3M, a team of researchers where we're working to deploy a solution that we believe could play a big part, but a pretty significant part in solving this, what I'll call the CO2 problem. We're also working with a startup company in parallel, trying to really scale a new technology that I'll talk a little bit more about in just a few minutes. I do want to acknowledge that we had early stage support from ARPA-E, yes, and that was very important, especially to a for-profit company like ours. To be able to do something long-term takes a little bit of an extra pain off the edge there, so thank you for that. We've been through that. We're continuing to invest. You should each have a page on your chair that I'm going to talk about the front side a bit of philosophically for just a minute or two, and then switch to talking a little bit more about the solution that we're working at. So the first point, if you're looking at the global CO2 is rising chart, there was new ice core data. Well, actually, let me back up. 3M is basically a diversified technology company. We like to make innovative materials for all kinds of different applications and all kinds of different markets. We've been in the sustainability mindset in the company for many decades, and so when we turned our attention to this CO2 is rising problem, we thought, well, what can we do with our material expertise to bring to bear a solution on this? So we don't really have a bone to pick or even a position in this so much as we see that there's a solution that's needed, and so we want to contribute to that suite of solutions. So the new information on the ice core data is that they just found new 2.7 million year old ice core and have analyzed the gas inside those bubbles there that represent it from that time, and it's still under the 300 parts per million that we see on the chart from 800,000 years, going between 300 and 200, 300 and 200. Those are ice ages from the tilt of the Earth. And then until we get to very recent times where it's doing this. So it's statistically different behavior. And even though it sounds like a small amount when we talk about it's in parts per million, 400 parts per million, but that small change has a butterfly effect. It has a big impact on the climate system. So we think that's important. Another little tidbit that we like to think about as sort of looking at the situation, if we were to put a boundary around the Earth's atmosphere and look at the incoming energy from the sun that hits the Earth, in all these 800,000 years, it would reflect back out to space, a portion of that. It would hit the Earth, the heat would reflect back out of the system that we have. But now with the heat-trapping gases like the CO2 that's there, less of it can escape out of the system and it remains in the system. So we're really adding energy into the system. So that energy, at a high level, could do one of about three main things. It can turn to kinetic energy. It's thermal, so it's heat, so it increases temperature. And it can be used to change the phase of things. So we think about, for example, Arctic ice, changing phase from a solid ice to a liquid water. We think about the vastness of the oceans on the first surface of the Earth that changes from the liquid evaporating to water vapor gas, which, by the way, is another greenhouse gas. And by the way, that thermal energy makes it there's a positive feedback loop that makes that more and more evaporation happening. So all of this means that there's an issue to be dealt with. We see it manifested in just the temperature rise. This is thermometer data, pretty indisputable as well. But the one other point that I want to make on this front page is that, there's also a human performance, a human health factor that we don't talk about enough, I don't think. There's been experiments like the one I've cited here where, you take people, willing people, being subjected to higher and higher levels of CO2 to see what happens. And for instance, this study explains that they then measure people's ability to do simple awareness, to do simple tasks, and to do strategy and problem solving. And in all cases, as the CO2 level rises, their ability to do those things statistically and significantly go down. So we just can't not have a lower carbon future. So that's kind of the one thing that really motivated our team to say, okay, what can we do, our little part of what we can bring with technology. So on the other side, we've decided to take the approach of helping to do a utilization technology. We're applying some nanostructure technology, some roll-to-roll processing, low-cost manufacturing technology to make components. This is where we can play our little part. We can make components that can enable what would be a new-to-the-world device that we could call a carbon dioxide electrolyzer. And with some new technology, with new catalyst systems that we've developed just for this purpose, we've been able to take the amount of energy that it has typically taken to break that very stable CO2 molecule and that bond, we've been able to take that and cut that amount of energy required in half. So you still have to put energy in to break the bond, but it takes much less energy, and that's less cost. So all of this goes towards enabling the utilization. It activates the CO2 to make it more reactive, more useful. So we also are working on a similar system, a sister system, if you will, of water electrolysis, which has traditionally been used only in certain situations because it's much more expensive than hydrogen from steam methane reforming. It's still more expensive, but we see a path to getting it down significantly. Again, it's through technology, through nanostructures and new capabilities that we can bring with materials. So the example that I give, and it's just one example, is that what this could enable if we were to electrolyze CO2 in water is synthesis gas or syngas, which is a very commonly used intermediate in oil and gas, in chemical making. To quote a very large oil and gas company in Europe, quote, they say, "Oh, we know what to do with syngas. Thank you." So if we could get it using renewable energy to power this electrical process, as the mix of energy changes, this could render low-carbon fuel. And left to our own devices, we would probably, if the situation were different, we would probably choose to go to a niche market where there's like lower volume and higher margins, and that's the typical route. But this isn't a typical situation. We have to worry about what can use this much CO2. This is a large-scale problem. And the only thing that can utilize enough CO2 is fuels. So we've got several downstream partners that does syngas to diesel and gasoline and methanol and jet fuel and all the rest. This is feasible. We could also partner with other bio processes to get to certain materials. It's quite selective to do bio routes for some things. So what we want to enable is a low temperature, low pressure process that can activate the CO2, make it into a useful form of carbon that's very reactive that could then go on to make it. So Bob alluded to this roadmap for a sustainable future that's similar to our thinking as well, and that is that we must decarbonize all the sectors. So we decarbonize the power industry by continuing to add the renewable mix as we can, and transition or capture from fossil, or hopefully a safer form of nuclear. And then on the transportation sector, we want to maximize what we can electrify in the car fleet, but with long-haul trucks, with heavy equipment, with airplanes, with ships, it's going to probably need these hydrocarbons for a time to come. So let's deliver a carbon neutral or low carbon fuel to those industries by utilizing that which we do not emit, and this would help tremendously to get that become more in control of the carbon loop instead of the other way around. So look forward to any questions, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, everyone, for the invitation and just for gathering this morning. It's a beautiful morning, and I hope we get out to enjoy maybe in the afternoon a little bit later. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about CO2 recycling. My name is Marcius Extavour. I work at the XPRIZE Foundation, and I'm mostly going to speak to you a little bit about what we're doing with something called the NRG COSIA Carbon XPRIZE. But before I get into that, I just want to emphasize a little bit about, I think, why we're here on this panel and what we're here to discuss. We're here to discuss alternate ways of using CO2, putting that U in the CCUS. There is a lot of new thinking and new activity, I think, in the sector. There are a lot of new things going on. The Carbon Prize is one of a few. And it's important to just note that new things are happening and that new thinking is being brought to bear. People have been talking about recycling carbon dioxide and various things related to that, I think, for a long time. But there are now some new technologies being brought to bear and some new approaches that I think are making a lot of quick progress. Quickly, this field can turn into acronym soup, like everything else in DC or in all technical fields. I'm going to use the phrase CO2 conversion. By that, I mean taking carbon dioxide and actually transforming it into something else. Other phrases people have used are utilization or CO2 as a feedstock, using it as an ingredient. So at XPRIZE, we focus on competitions. The Carbon XPRIZE is actually just a competition. I'll tell you about the details, but it's an open call to innovators around the world to demonstrate a utilization solution. A few people have mentioned already today the need for new approaches, new utilization, let's say that goes beyond EOR or takes it in a different direction. And this is, we hope, like moths to a flame, smart and creative people bringing new ideas and actually demonstrating what they can do in a public setting. The competition, we're right in the thick of it. I'll tell you the details, but we're about halfway through this thing. It's going to run for around 5 years total. And this is our ethos at XPRIZE. In general, we don't necessarily know how to solve grand challenge problems ourselves, but we know how to invite others that are more creative than us to do it. We have a track record of identifying grand challenges, which frankly a lot of people know how to do. A lot of people know how to say, as Laura just did, the CO2 level is a crisis. What are we going to do about it? At XPRIZE, what we say is we can structure a format, a tool called a competition, develop a prize purse, develop a structure that allows innovators from around the world to actually showcase and demonstrate what they can do. We're in the semifinals of this competition, and again, it's about CO2 conversion, specifically into valuable products. I'll tell you about what valuable means in a second to us, but we're about halfway through. So that means we have 22 teams in the semifinal stage of this competition. They come from 6 different countries. 13 of them are based here in the US, a bunch in Canada, and then we have teams scattered around the world. And they're all using some kind of different technology or different process, and often producing different materials. What they have in common is that they take flue gas, in this case out of a power plant, but ultimately it could be sourced from anywhere, and are trying to execute a conversion technology. In about 3 weeks, my colleagues and I are going to take off our DC uniforms and put on coveralls and actually go visit all of these sites for the first time, and we'll get to see and adjudicate the technologies up close, which is fun. I'm an engineer by training, so it'll be fun to put on the hard hat again and see, frankly, which ones work less well, maybe which ones don't work at all. That's all part of this, and we'll be selecting the best of these to move on to the finals and ultimately compete for the $20 million grand prize purse. So just stepping back a second, I think sometimes it's a bit abstract to think about the idea of converting CO2 into stuff. What does that mean? The way I like to think about it is that if you look around the room, most of the room is actually made of carbon or carbonaceous materials, like the synthetic fibers in my suit. It's not that fancy. Shoes, rugs, the concrete that this building is made of. These are actually all carbon-containing products. The hope and the dream of CO2 conversion is that many of these products could be made and sourced from CO2. And even better, if that CO2 were anthropogenic CO2, the type of CO2 we're trying to get rid of, then there's a virtuous circle there. I want to be clear that this is not a silver bullet. You have to really stretch your imagination to imagine replacing all carbon feedstocks with CO2. But what sets CO2 conversion into products apart is that it has the promise of revenue, independent revenue stream. If the thing you make out of CO2 is worth something, you can sell it and generate an independent revenue stream to finance your project and maybe finance larger scale projects that together
can really take a bite out of the CO2 problem. So what kind of stuff are teams actually attempting? There's a team actually based here in DC that's trying to make carbon fiber. The same type of carbon fiber bike that I'm trying to save up to buy for myself, that carbon fiber could be made of CO2, or tennis rackets or shoes. Right now it's sporting equipment, but carbon fiber experts really focus on things like structural elements of carbon fiber. That might be an interesting thing for our futures. Some of that carbon fiber could be made of CO2, which is interesting. There's a team based in Rhode Island called Catalyst. They have a platform for making chemicals like methane, methanol, and various alcohols, consumable and non-consumable alcohols, out of CO2. We'll be looking forward to visiting their site, not sampling while we're on duty, but taking a look at what they're up to and seeing how far they can take this technology, CO2 to chemicals. There's another team, it was mentioned earlier, they're about to set up a new facility in West Virginia. They're called Protein Power. They use a rebreather technology that NASA developed actually several decades ago for use on spacecraft and space stations to recycle CO2, in this case into amino acids, which means proteins, which means food. They're trying to go to the CO2 to agricultural products chain, which is really fascinating, about to set up in West Virginia. And there's another team I want to make mention of, low energy consumption CO2 capture and conversion. It's a mouthful, we call them LEC4, but they are also working on methanol and other platform chemicals. They're based in the state of Wyoming. Wyoming has a particular story to play in this competition. I'll come back to that because of the integrated test center that Senator Barrasso mentioned and a couple other touch points. The point is, we're seeing all kinds of technologies and products demonstrated and experimented with in the competition. It'll be a really exciting time for us to evaluate them all against each other. It is a competition. Right now, these semifinalists are competing for $5 million that we're going to award in the new year, and then the remaining 15 is going to go to the people that win the grand prize. To win, by the way, you have to actually scale this thing up. To win, you actually have to build a real working pilot adjacent to an operating power system. So there's a facility in Gillette, Wyoming, called the Integrated Test Center. We were there a few weeks ago checking out its construction. It's due to be commissioned later this year, early next year. It's essentially a test center for testing these types of technologies at scale. I want to point out how unique this is. It's unusual to be able to build a new technology, call a power station, and say, I'd like to plug it in and maybe test it out and run a few, that conversation never goes well. Turns out owners of industrial facilities don't like you to mess around with their stuff and try new things, even if you say things like innovation and the future. So it's a miracle that the Integrated Test Center is actually getting up and running. This type of innovation infrastructure at scale is what we need to bring industrial technologies to the fore and make these things real. There's a sister facility called the Alberta Carbon Capture and Conversion Technology Center in Calgary. It is adjacent to a natural gas facility. The finals of the competition are going to take place at those two facilities, but those facilities themselves will live on beyond the competition, we hope, as hubs for this type of innovation. The last point I want to leave you with is that I spoke about converting CO2 into stuff and the excitement about people trying things and innovation. Even though we focus on the technology development, putting on coveralls, measuring these systems, ultimately, development of technology is not enough. Building something in your garage, or in this case, at the ITC, is not enough. It's not just going to flow into the world on its own. You can't just ship them like you can a piece of software or a piece of electronics. It is ultimately going to take an ecosystem approach. At XPRIZE, we focus on the tech breakthrough, but we also want to put in place some structures that we think can make these systems real and valuable when they are demonstrated and achieved. The first of those is a program we call Reimagine CO2. When you're thinking about new innovation, really you have to put yourself in the mindset of what is possible. For us, this is a series of workshops and convenings meant to stimulate people, inspire them using the prize, not only about what can be done with CO2, but about other related problems in climate, in resource management, and in energy. We've executed a couple of those this year, and we look forward to a few more of those in the years to come. The last, or second, is something we've just getting off the ground now. We call it the Circular Carbon Network. I spoke about technology, I spoke about innovation. We have a real emphasis on the needs and opportunities for private sector investment. There were questions about the role of government, and there's absolutely a role to play. But we also think family offices, VC, private equity, international corporates have a crucial role and opportunity to play here, not just benefiting from valuable products produced from CO2, but ultimately becoming investors at early stage to help these things scale and grow. We have a program in place to really focus on that conversation. What is it going to take to drive more investment in this space? Being realistic about the barriers and challenges, but also asking ourselves honestly, how can we accelerate this space, learning from other new technology spaces. As a last remark I'll leave you with, we'll be at Climate Week next week. We have an event next Thursday. We've just put together a report, essentially a bit of analysis and market survey of investors telling us what they think they see as value and frankly not value in this space, and really trying to curate a conversation that way. So really looking forward to more discussion. Ask me more about the XPRIZE teams. I'll be happy to tell you about all 22, and look forward to speaking with you all. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bill Brown. I'm the CEO of Net Power, and I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and thank you for having me today. We all owe a great debt of gratitude to the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES. They lead the way in so many ways in bringing us unbiased, critical thinking in the area of energy and climate. And for that, we're very appreciative. All the people there that I've met are inspired, hardworking, creative, and most importantly, effective. You know, special thanks to Janet and Bob and Fatima and everyone else on the team. We're also indebted to all those here in the room who are on this path with us. NRG, MHI, Oxy, 3M, COSIA and NRG, the XPRIZE people. And there are so many people here in the audience to whom we also owe a debt of gratitude, and I thank you guys for going down this path with us as well. Before getting into a little discussion on Net Power, I thought it'd be helpful to take stock. First thing that we sometimes forget is that we generally have in life a wrong place problem. Water in the wrong place is not good. Heat in the wrong place is not good. Cold in the wrong place is not good. Salt in the wrong place is not good. Same thing with CO2, but for some reason, we seem to think that CO2 is just a problem, not that it's just in the wrong place. And I would encourage us all to think more critically and scientifically about the CO2 problem. The second thing I'd like to do in taking stock is focus on two charts. You guys have a handout, and if you look at the Net Power handout, on the back at the bottom, there are two charts. And I'd like to start focusing on the one on the right. These are two smart people charts. The first chart on the lower right is put together from data from Sam Thernstrom and Steve Brick. I'm sure many of you people know them. That chart has an arced curve going from the lower left to the upper right. The x-axis on that is the cost of power. The y-axis on that is the amount of CO2 abatement. This study was done with Germany, California, and Wisconsin. These numbers are based on not LCOE numbers, they are based on system-wide numbers of cost of electricity in the system coming from two different sources. One was the natural gas combined cycle, and the other was renewable portfolio standards as they exist in those three jurisdictions, which represent the largest penetration of renewables anywhere. If you look at the lower left-hand corner of that arc, you have a cost of electricity of roughly $65 a megawatt hour, but no carbon abatement. That's from natural gas combined cycle acting alone. If you want to get to 50% carbon abatement, you have to double the price of power and throw in 50% renewable portfolio standard. Pretty good. 50% reduction, only double the price of electricity? I'm in for that. Now if you want to reduce it 70%, you start moving out the curve and it becomes flatter. And if you want to reduce it 85%, you end up with 200% renewable portfolio standard, but still you notice that you have to have 77% of your original combined cycle power plants existing. By the time you finish this exercise, the cost of power has gone up 6-fold. You know, we see that renewables are effective, but they have diminishing returns as we need them more and more to abate some of our carbon. That leads us to the next smart person chart. That's the chart at the lower left-hand side, and that's by the MIT smart people. Perhaps understanding that everything has a cost-benefit analysis and that everything ends up having diminishing returns, which is not surprising in any world that you ever live in. They show you that as long as they can see, fossil fuels are part of the equation. Now, they look at renewables, hydro, nuclear, gas, biofuels. They look at it globally in the developed world, in the developing world, and the rest of the world. And no matter what you see, fossil fuels are there. Now, what does that tell us? Other than to extend this news cycle a little bit longer, alternate nasal breathing, there is a solution to this problem. Unless we have a major technological advance, we really have to focus on an all-of-the-above strategy. And because fossil fuels are here, and because at some point we can push against it as much as we want to, those who have fossil fuels, the weight of the world is on their shoulders. They've got to do something about it. And to do something about it means if we do not turn CO2 into an opportunity, carbon capture and sequestration will be an expensive endeavor that will face almost impossible headwinds. So we at Net Power are trying to do our part to turn that CO2 into an opportunity. Net Power is a new technology. We have almost completed our demonstration plant, 50-megawatt demonstration plant that you can see on the front page of that handout. It's outside of Houston, Texas, southeast of Houston, in a place called La Porte. Let me tell you what Net Power does. It burns fossil fuels, but it captures almost all, 99+% of the CO2. There's no NOx. I mean, zero NOx. It can go forward without water. Without water, we can take a 2 to 3 percentage point efficiency hit and not have to use water. In addition to electricity, and this is the "and there's more" piece, in addition to electricity, we produce nitrogen, saleable carbon dioxide, saleable argon. Now, with that, go back to the thermostat brick chart with the arc in it. This means if you mix Net Power in with renewables, you don't have an arc anymore starting at the lower left. You have a flat line starting at the upper left. You start out with fossil fuels, have 100% CO2 mitigation, and you can mix them with renewables with full comfort of knowing that we can have a fossil fuels future, but zero carbon footprint. This means that the world can meet every climate target it ever desires and not have to pay more for electricity. That's important. As I mentioned earlier, we are demonstrating our plant 50 megawatt level at La Porte, Texas. Construction's virtually complete. Harvey left us unscathed. For a while there, we were an island, and we could only see getting off the plant site by boat. But we're now connected to the mainland again, and we're now focusing commissioning our plant. Our combustor is going to be tested at the end of this year, and from that, we'll move to connecting to the grid. We'll have a full plant that we will specify in the middle of next year for delivery in 2021. This time next year, we will be talking about what 2021 looks like. So if you're down in the Houston area, come see us. And let's figure out how together we can impact our planet by harnessing fugitive carbon and using it for the benefit of all mankind. For that, I actually now turn it over to Julio Friedmann, Carbon Wrangler Extraordinaire.
Thank you very much, Bill. And before I say something, let me say something. I also want to thank Fatima Ahmad, Bob, Dr. Peace. By the way, how did you get the name Dr. Peace? Like, you just won. You're like the two people from Opus 12, Dr. Cool and Dr. Cave. Anyways, thank you all for putting this panel together, and also thanks to my panelists. They are undertaking a brave and difficult journey as entrepreneurs and as actors, and they need to be celebrated for what they're doing. I enter this conversation in many different ways, but today I'm coming to you as an eco-modernist and as a techno-optimist. Because the fact is we keep innovating, and innovations are good, and we, generally speaking, they enter the market and people's lives are better because of it. I'll come back to that a little bit towards the end. But to get back to something that many of you probably know, actually, quick question, who here is a chemist? Couple of chemists, excellent. I'll try to speak slowly. Who here's an engineer? I'm so sorry. Who here's another kind of scientist? Okay, who here's a journalist? Okay, thank you, that's very helpful. So some of you might not actually know this. The chemists are the only ones who for sure know this. Carbon's the backbone of the US economy. This whole room is basically made out of carbon except for the glass in the back. And we could make that out of carbon, actually. The glass could be made out of polycarbonate instead of out of silicon. Our bodies are made out of carbon, the food's made out of carbon, the stuff behind me is made of carbon, the seats you're sitting on are made out of carbon. It's like gets to sort of what Bill was talking about in terms of a wrong place problem. We don't actually have any problem with this carbon, for the most part. We're actually pretty happy with it. And in fact, we move huge volumes of material, billions and billions of tons of carbon through our economy every day. I'm sorry, every year, I should say. And that's for real. No one is anti-rain. Plenty of people are anti-flood. And so that's sort of the way that I think about this. It is actually a wrong place problem, and whether you're making Apple's carbon fiber roof or whether you're buying plastics to actually bail out your basement from flooding, whatever the deal is, you're actually glad to have these things in the world, and there's just a better way to think about them. Today we make them out of hydrocarbons because that was kind of what we had. We started 100 years ago and people said, hey, we have hydrocarbons, we can make this stuff out of hydrocarbons, and we sort of got on with that business, and that was interesting. Now we have an opportunity to make carbon materials from a different way. We can actually make them out of CO2 instead. You guys have a little handout here that I gave you, and you could follow along if you'd like. I'm voting with my feet on the carbon wrangling stuff. I've launched a company, Carbon Wrangler, and I think about it very much in three ways. In this, I was advised by the great Bill McDonough. For those of you who know Bill, he's the one who launched the circular economy and the cradle-to-cradle economy and all these sorts of things. Terrific environmentalist. Terrific designer, among other things. He also, I think, designed the International Space Station, kind of a guy. And Bill wrote a paper last year in Nature in which he basically talked about this wrong problem, or this wrong place problem. And so he said this is how we should think about carbon. We want to keep it from going into the air. We want to make a closed loop so that we recycle the carbon that's out there, and then we want to actually repatriate the carbon. We want to restore it back to the natural world, pulling it from our air and oceans. And that's what I call carbon wrangling. Today I'm just going to focus on the second bit, which is a lot of what Dr. Extavour was talking about earlier. We actually should be thinking sensibly about what can we do with this stuff. Here I have to talk a bit like the engineers do, and I apologize for that. It turns out that the second law of thermodynamics is a harsh mistress. If you're going to break the carbon bonds that Laura was talking about, you need to actually put energy in. And if that energy is carbon-based, then you're not actually doing too much. You've got problems of a different sort in terms of the life cycle. But in fact, there's a lot of stuff that you can turn and do that actually doesn't require extra energy inputs. This is called going thermodynamically downhill. It turns out carbon dioxide is a pretty stable material, but it's not the most. Carbonate is the most stable material, actually. That's the stuff that you, when I go to sleep tonight, I take a Tums. That's carbonate. The front of this building is made of carbonate. It's a very, very stable geological material. Limestone is made out of carbonate. Well, there's people out there who are turning carbon dioxide into carbonate. In fact, one of the projects I worked on when I was at the Department of Energy is the Skyonic project. These guys are quarrying CO2 out of a cement plant. They're basically scavenging it out the back end, and they're turning it into baking soda, and they're also turning it into, sulfuric acid, and they're selling that on the market. I'm sorry, hydrogen chloride, my mistake. But the punchline is that they're actually grabbing 83,000 tons of CO2 a year. And in doing so, they're actually displacing about 300,000 tons of CO2 a year. This plant is operational. The whole thing looks like an ice cream cake. It's all covered up with white dust because they're making baking soda. But in fact, they're shipping this stuff out, and their next project is limestone. Their next project is, instead of making baking soda, which is a small market, we're going to go into the 7 billion ton a year market, which is limestone. This plant's operational. It exists. It's capturing and offsetting carbon in the market. That's a plus. And these guys are basically profitable today, and that's a good thing. Another company that I want to draw your attention to is an interesting one started by some people at Columbia University. They're based in Shanghai, called Green Ore. And basically what they said is, hey, we can make carbonate by taking carbon dioxide from some facility and reacting it with steel slag. And it turns out you can. And in fact, that solves two problems. You get rid of the waste heap that's associated with the steel slag, and then you can sell it as road aggregate. Double win. I don't know why people might think this is bad. You're solving two waste problems at once and creating revenues. And in fact, these guys are launching their plant very soon. They're actually taking the CO2 from a coal to liquids facility in Baotou, and they're reacting it with the steel slags in Baotou steel to turn it into useful products. That's all very good. These are big markets, and in fact, there's about a dozen companies that are working into this space. Solidia is an example of one, Calera is another one, but there's a bunch of these companies that actually are turning CO2 into cement or road aggregate or these other sorts of things. And if you can do that, you don't actually need much energy, if any. It's actually thermodynamically favored, which is nice. If you did it really well, you might actually be able to harvest some energy, which is also a nice thing worth thinking about. Anything else you're going to do, though, you're going to need to input green electrons. And I have a confession to make. For many years, when people gave me a pitch, and they had a diagram that said, insert green electrons here, I just threw it in the trash. Because I said, look, that's just on a cost and economic and utilization and optimization base, and that's not. I don't say that anymore. And the reason why is actually we are now in a surprising new world, and that world is a world of energy abundance. We have abundant green energy now. We have abundant low-carbon energy now, and it's getting cheaper, and it's getting more available, and the capacity factors are rising, and the dispatch is increasing. That's all good news. That also means that we often have that energy when we can't use it, which means we would like to be able to use it for something. Some people want to use it for batteries. I want to use it to make stuff. And in fact, you can think instead about what kind of industries can be born if we actually take carbon dioxide and these cheap green electrons and put them to good use. There's actually a fairly large effort within the national labs. It's one of their big ideas. Every year they get together and pitch a big idea. This year, one of their big ideas is called Carbon, which is an acronym that I won't spell out. But the punchline is take this abundant, cheap, low-carbon energy. It's got to be lower than near-zero carbon energy or else this don't work. And then react it with stuff and make stuff. It's not that hard a concept. It's tough engineering. It's hard. I don't want to be glib about this at all. The challenge is actually dramatic. It is not easy to do, but we have to do it anyways. We have to do it for the climate, and we want to make revenues. So a lot of people like this idea. The punchline here is it's hard. It's going to end up starting small. We're not going to get to 10 gigatons fast doing this, if ever. Might die small. But the flip side of this is it's valuable, it's positive, and it's actually necessary. And so these people work for you. And hopefully the national labs can keep doing what they're doing. I'm going to close on just two things that I can speak about from my own national lab when I was at Lawrence Livermore that are kind of interesting, and this gets back to the whole point of innovating. Often I get in discussions with people who assume that we're locked into place, that we're not going to innovate anymore, nothing's going to change, and we're stuck. And people like Bill and people like Laura are proving us wrong all the time, but people still like this narrative. Or it's even worse, some people say, those guys won't innovate, but we will. We're just going to innovate in the fossil energy space, or we're just going to innovate in the renewable space, and then we're going to beat everybody else, as if that's actually how it works. But fundamentally, innovation's good. And I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things that should blow your mind because this stuff is actually pretty radical. And it gives you a sense of what's possible if you get out of the mindset of carbon as a problem and into a mindset of carbon's an opportunity. How can we maximize it? So one of the things you might know a little bit about, and I do mean a little bit, is 3D printing or additive manufacturing. I know a lot about it compared to most people. I don't know very much about it compared to the people who really understand it. But if you haven't tracked this, we're right now printing human cartilage. We're printing ears. We're about 3 years away from printing human organs. We're getting pretty radical about what we can make now with additive manufacturing. We're printing cars. We're printing planes. We're printing houses. Well, it turns out that that's sort of the easy stuff to do. The stuff that's kind of wacky is actually making things that don't exist using additive manufacturing. And it's one of the things we're doing at the lab. One of the things we've done is we've figured out how to basically print out a polymer with a catalyst in it. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but what it means is it's a membrane that does chemical work. The membrane, the reactor, they're the same thing. We don't even have a good name for these things. We don't know what to call them, membrane reactors or bespoke reactors or something like that, because the concept's so novel. But in fact, we have already turned methane to methanol at room temperature and room pressure with no energy input. And you just run air and methane over it, and liquid fuel drops out the bottom. Kind of neat. Turns out you can do the same thing converting CO2. Turns out you can actually put in CO2, and you can put in electricity or heat and turn it into stuff. And we are currently making methanol. We would like to make ethylene, which is an important chemical feedstock, and we're well on our way to making that. And it ends up that you put this great taste together with another great taste, which is material by design. You basically take supercomputers, you bang through a bunch of quantum electrodynamic calculations, and you say, oh, that's the molecule I want. Let's go build it. That means you actually don't have to wait for nature to get around to doing this stuff. You can actually hack the system and make your own. One of the things that's likely to come out of this is that eventually inorganic systems are going to beat organic systems. Plants are pretty bad at thermodynamic conversion because they have to do stuff like reproduce and grow and make reactive surface area and respirate water and all this other stuff. It turns out a solar panel doesn't have to do that. So solar panel efficiencies are way better than plants today. I predict that the efficiency of these kinds of novel reactors are going to blow past anything that biological systems can do, and they're going to get faster and cheaper and better and can be reproduced anywhere for super low cost. Are we there yet? No. But it's a pretty compelling vision about what you could do. The last thing I want to talk to you about is something that Senator Whitehouse had mentioned on the way out, which was direct ocean capture. Ocean acidification is a proper challenge, and it's often the poor, neglected stepchild in the climate change debate. Even if you change solar radiation management and do geoengineering, we still have ocean acidification. It's a real thing, and it's impacting fisheries, and we're killing corals, and we're dramatically dropping marine biomass, and all these things are a consequence of this. So far, the only solution that we have is to basically grind up limestone and dump it in the ocean. We give the ocean a Tums every year. And that's not a great solution. You don't really want to fix a problem in the ocean by adding more stuff to the ocean. What's the alternative? Pull it out. Why not? Pull out the carbon dioxide. And actually, I want to give some credit to Noah Deitch from the Center for Carbon Removal, who started working on the problem years ago of how do we pull carbon and harvest it out of the atmosphere, and is now also thinking about how do we make a new carbon economy out of this stuff, and is also now thinking how do we get it out of the oceans. And this is all very useful stuff to do, and it turns out we invented a technology that does this. We've made little bitty artificial cells. And these artificial cells are basically microbeads that do ionic exchange, but they work just like a cell. And you can put in an enzyme into the gas exchangeable membrane or into a liquid in the middle or whatever, and you can actually just pull carbon dioxide out. And what happens is something interesting. If you drop these beads into the ocean or into a bucket of water and they start pulling out the CO2, you precipitate building materials. You actually make limestone. You make calcium carbonates of various kinds, and in fact, that's stuff that is used for building. It's used for road aggregates, it's used for cement, it's used for all these additives. Well, the reason I started thinking about this stuff was because I was worried about the island nations of the Pacific. Their presidents have all said they're not going to move to Indonesia, they're going to stay where they are, but guess what? They're all drowning. Their plan is to build vertically, and they have no money, and they have no materials. What are they going to do? And I thought, wait a second, these guys are not tiny island nations, they are huge ocean empires. They have, Kiribati is the size of Texas. It's Goliath. Their resource is ocean. Hey, I'm a carbonate geochemist. Maybe we can pull the carbon dioxide out of the ocean and make some building materials for them. And then I'll hand the CO2 over to Laura, and she can make fuels out of it, because the price of fuels in Kiribati is $10 a gallon. You do it locally. And then these guys have a revenue that they can sell while they save their oceans and deacidify their waters. So and this is just the tip of the spear. This is just the thinnest veneer on the innovation that's going out there. There are hundreds of companies, there are researchers all over the world in universities and national labs in private industry who are creating the future for us. And frankly, we should give them a push. We should give them some help. We should give them a nudge. We should try to think about ways to incent innovation and incent businesses and incent opportunity, as opposed to saying there's one and only one good way to lose weight. I actually like my menus, all of the above. And it actually means that you have the lowest risk and the lowest cost. And so I hope that this is something that gets added to the deck as we think about how we're going to build the future. Thank you very much.
So you guys excited about that technology, those technologies yet? Pretty interesting, aren't they? I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I have questions. Before we get to those questions, though, I just want to echo the thank you to a few folks before you all escape. Fatima Ahmed, where are you? Fatima, I know you're here. This event would not have been possible without Fatima's diligence and dogged determination. Also, Manjot running that microphone's not easy. We have John, Dan, and Christiana who have been helping get this event going and making it run smoothly. Alec for making sure that everybody stays on time. So thank you to all of our staff. Thank you for coming. And with that, I'm just going to jump right into a question, and then I'm going to let you guys ask a question. So Bob asked his panel about what policies are needed. What policies do you guys think are needed to get your technologies deployed? And I'm going to start with you, Laura, and then we'll just go right down there.
So this is, yeah. Policy, well, there are at least 10,000 ways
Okay.
that could happen.
Any of them will. What do you think is most?
Almost any of them will help.
Okay.
I work in a company where over 60% of our products are less than 5 years old. So by virtue of that metric, my project is probably, if not the longest term one in the company, it is. So it's hard to fight to keep it in the portfolio. We need support. We need, even the ARPA-E support, which isn't a lot of funds. It's helpful. It takes a little bit of the pain away, and it allows us to do that front-end work. This is platform building, and it takes time, and it takes money, and it takes non-interruption. So if you interrupt that process and have to start again, you lose a lot of time, and we don't have time to lose. So funding innovation, funding. What I like about this topic is that there really is something in it for everyone, no matter what kind of, life experience you've had. So it seems to me that we should be prioritizing this type of work because it has so many multiple benefits. So I've been encouraging different offices of the DOE even to talk together and say, okay, this benefits bioenergy, it benefits fossil energy, it benefits, renewable energy. And why don't we pick a few things like this where something like this could benefit all of the agendas? So I think, funding is one thing. Deployment is as you have mentioned about the Petronova, it can be very expensive. First-time syndrome, you're very brave to do it. There's going to be a lot of learning that comes out of it that's going to benefit a lot of people in the future. And so that kind of commercialization funding is also, I think, necessary to make it accelerate.
Great, thanks, Laura. Anybody else want to add to that? Marcus, do you want to just go down the row?
Sure, thank you. This sounds like it's working. I think, from my perspective, as I observe these technologies under development, a couple of places where government can play a needed and obvious role. One is in nurturing the development of new technologies, some of the types I alluded to, Julio mentioned, some of the things you see represented on the panel. There are a lot of different ideas out there for managing CO2. Some of them are very mature, but some of them aren't. The ones that are immature absolutely need funding at early stage R&D. But for those that are mature, and there are plenty of those, they're, taking a step back, I said at XPRIZE, we're asking investors, what's it going to take for you to make an active investment in one of these things? And some of the answers that came back were, we just need to see more bankable projects. If they're out there, we haven't heard about them, or maybe they aren't quite out there. Help to get pilot projects off the ground. people debate about whether we need more pilots. It's fashionable to say, we don't need more pilots, we need big action. But from the investor community, bankable projects in the form of pilots where the economics make sense are helpful. The last thing I'll say is that, as Laura mentioned, it doesn't just have to be tax incentive or direct spend. It can be things like leveraging technical and business and convening expertise within the public sector.
Very good.
Yeah, I would go with, first of all, there are 2 valleys of death. Some people will come up with 20 valleys of death, but there are 2 valleys of death that are relevant. One is the invention valley of death, and the other is the commercialization valley of death. And each one of those have to be addressed. And I think we're actually pretty good at addressing a lot of the invention valley of death. Why? Because it's cheaper. The commercialization valley of death is really difficult, especially in an industry as conservative as the utilities industry and the power generation industry. And that is where we need to see the return of the level of demonstration projects that we saw with the Recovery Act. Now, admittedly, a lot of those projects never came to fruition, but some did. And the fact is, that helped. And so I think we need more of that.
Very good. Julio?
Hello? Okay. The question was, what kind of policies could we use? 4 quick, punchy answers. First, we are clearly going to benefit from an accelerated and strengthened R&D and innovation agenda. And that's a pretty easy policy. It's not really, in fact, it's nonpartisan. It's not even bipartisan. Everybody thinks we need more innovation, and science is good for the most part. I actually see both ARPA-E and the Office of Fossil Energy sitting next to each other over there across the room. Like, that's what we need. We need those guys not only working together, but scientists don't work for hugs. They actually need to get paid, and that means and they really don't want to work for 1 year. They want to work for 2 or 3 or 4 to solve the problem they need to solve. So sustained, substantial funding for R&D is important. Another policy measure that is underused but really could make a big difference here, procurement authorities. If somebody out there started saying 3% of the fuels that we have are going to be low carbon fuels, and not renewable fuels, low carbon fuels, that would matter. If one of the things I'm doing in my free time these days is talking to the Chinese government about the One Belt, One Road project. They're going to spend $1 trillion. If they made 2% of their procurement low carbon cement, would create a market, it would change the industry overnight. And it would be a rounding error on the financing of that project, right? So procurement authorities are actually a way to stimulate or catalyze a market that's pretty straightforward and relatively low risk. In a similar sort of thing, standards. One example, the place to start from is building standards. Same sort of thing. If California one day said 5% of particle board has to be low carbon and this is how we define it, you'd create companies overnight that would be making particle board. It's helpful, by the way, to set those standards to start a little ways out, because often if you say, well, we're going to do it in 2 years, then you'll fail because the stuff doesn't exist. But if you say, in 10 years we're going to need this, that matters. One example, California has said that in 2030, they are going to have a 50% renewable diesel standard. And in this case, renewable includes the kind of fuels that companies like 3M are trying to make.
Or enable making.
Yep.
We won't be making fuel.
The last thing to talk about is basically cheap capital. There's lots of different policy pathways to cheap capital. It doesn't have to be a specific incentive like the Futures Act. There's lots of different ways to think about it. Low-cost loans are one example of that. The loan program has been very, very successful, sustaining that and even broadening its mandates to include things like the pilots that Dr. Extavour and Bill are talking about are good things to think about. Another is there's a bill, the Portman-Bennett bill, which is on private equity bonds, or sorry, private activity bonds. This is basically tax-exempt debt. Most people don't know this, over 90% of the scrubbers in this country that scrub sulfur out of smokestacks were paid for by tax-exempt financing. Low-cost capital matters if you're making a project. Export-import authorities are another way to get through this. The list goes on, but those are really the main things. Innovation, procurement, building standards, and cheap capital. And I don't have a specific recipe for those policies, but there's plenty to do.
Very good. I have more questions, but I'd like to open it up to the audience at this point. There's a question back here. Manjot?
Hi, thank you. Arnaud Lambert with the Corn Refiners Association. I was just wondering, how do you relate the paradigm shift of too much carbon in the wrong place to energy regulation and agribusiness at the state and regional levels?
Complicated, lengthy answer, and we don't have time for it to talk about it at length, but here's the quick pitch. You got to just start by trying to get people to do the right thing. And you don't have to be obnoxious about it. I try to get my kids to clean the room all the time. And sometimes I use a carrot and sometimes I use a stick, but I never actually beat them. You know, there's lots of ways to get the job done. But you actually have to send the signal, and the signal has to be unambiguous. And people who understand the power sector, understand agribusiness, know how difficult those industries are to really operate. And you can't just go in and monkey around with stuff. But one thing that I like to think about in this context is wherever you can get extra benefit out of it, go there. In the case of agribusiness, if you can save a waste stream or increase soil productivity or get extra yields, that's a good place to start. And there's plenty of carbon reduction practices that lead to that. Same thing in the power sector.
Yeah, from our perspective, from an engineer's perspective, we always look to invent things that are cheaper and better. And I think that the engineer, there's so much the engineer can do if they just had the vision of the horizon, over the horizon, that something could actually be cheaper and better than anything we can ever imagine today. And the more we encourage that sort of innovation, the better we'll get there. Policy is also helpful, but the engineer hammers look for engineer nails. Policy hammers look for policy nails. We're engineer hammer.
We're nerd hammers.
I'll just quickly add that in my experience, being extremely direct and basic about the needs and the opportunities, sectors like agriculture, generally agri-food and utilities, as Julio mentioned, they're hard businesses. They're not even sure necessarily what their options are sometimes, or how to execute on those options with respect to sort of a paradigm shift in carbon. So I think, you know, for me, very, very basic and explicit about here are things to think about, here are pathways, understanding what their pain points are, but then trying to be really clear about potential options for short term and then for long term to help them shape their investments.
Before we get to you, Frank, I think Laura wants to add.
Just one note about the bio side. You know, if we are making ethanol, say, half of that carbon is available. If we were to utilize that to make more ethanol, you could enable emission-free fuel making. So that's just one, that's about all I can comment on as far as agriculture goes and what we do there, but except to say that, you know, there are other biological processes that make very interesting molecules very selectively, which is hard to do in an industrial way. I think enabling syngas as a main feedstock is one thing we can do really well, but making a specific molecule very selectively that's more complex, you know, maybe that's better for the bio side. And then there needs to be hybridizing of these things together.
Good. Frank?
My question is for Dr. Extavour. The prize system seems to have developed a number of really interesting ideas, and so far as it's gone has worked. The problem is whether there's enough money in the prize system to commercialize or to lead toward commercialization of the winning ideas. The question is whether you feel you have any influence or any responsibility to obtain funds for the winners to get over this valley that Dr. Friedmann was talking about.
Great question. Short answer is yes and yes. You're right, the prize model is fundamentally a leverage model. We put $20 million together, that's a lot of money. But actually it's not a lot of money if you actually want to build something that can deal with even, let's say, 5 tons a year, 20 tons a year, never mind kilotons, gigatons, megatons. The prize model will work when it actually is a leverage model, which means if a participant in a prize can actually use their participation to raise follow-on funds. We have an explicit goal of helping the participants indirectly raise 10 times the size of a prize purse. So for instance, the first XPRIZE was called Ansari XPRIZE, build a rocket, launch it into space, $10 million prize purse. A couple of teams spent more than the prize purse, which sounds crazy, until you understand their ancillary benefits for them. They're actually really competing for the follow-on market opportunity. And it takes the broader community. First of all, the capital has to be available, but also the opportunity has to actually exist for other people to say, yeah, I'm going to support that team during the competition, or I'm going to support the winners or people that come out of the competition. If there isn't enough capital in the space, a prize model won't work. You didn't ask this question, but I'll give the answer to another question, which is what can government do? Without things like grants, DOE programs, other funding sources, a prize in this space can't be successful. 10x of 20 million is $200 million. Where's that money going to come from? It's not going to come from XPRIZE. What we can do, though, is try to, as we're beginning to do, and this is your question about our responsibility to help commercialize and support the winners. We're trying to start the conversation now among private capital providers. What is it going to take? Not just, here are some amazing companies, you should consider investing in them. We can do that. But then we also want to go a level deeper and say, but realistically, what is blocking investment today? Is there something, a role we can play now that we have a bit of leverage with the competition to help unlock that? And that's what we're trying to do here.
Other questions? We have one over here. ARPA-E.
Thank you. Madhav Acharya with ARPA-E. Just wanted to mention, amongst all the different options you guys are looking at, we've got a workshop next week looking at methane pyrolysis, so to avoid producing CO2 in the first place, stripping out hydrogen, using the carbon for other purposes. Going back to Julio, your point about direct ocean capture, I was wondering if you wanted to comment on direct air capture. That's something that's been focused on a lot. Whether you see maybe 10 years from now that direct air capture will be at the same stage where some of the technologies we're talking about today are right now.
Thank you very much. I love talking about this topic, in part because it's kind of nutty, and again, thermodynamically kind of doesn't make sense, but we actually know we need it, so we got to do it. The UN emissions gap report has come out year after year now for 10 years. I'm actually having the good fortune of working on the current draft, which should be out in November for the Conference of the Parties. And for the first time ever, they have created a chapter on carbon removal. And essentially, if you believe in climate science, you got to believe in climate math. The climate math is pretty ugly. And what happens is, if you look at all those wonderful, like this is what trajectory we should be on for 2 degrees, and this is what where we'll go with our UN development commitments, and this is what the Paris Agreement gets us to, we are actually on the worst case scenario trajectory. We're not even on the current policy trajectory. The globe is emitting way, way more than that. And if you just do the math, we blow our carbon budget in 20 years. If we're lucky, it's 20 years. We might blow our carbon budget in 6. So the more time we delay in reducing emissions, the more we're buying a debt of the future in which we have to pull CO2 out of the air and oceans. And so direct air capture ends up being one of those things you have to look at. It is by no means the only thing. There are biologically mediated pathways like planting trees and forests, restoring ecosystems, adding biochar to soils. There's kind of a hybrid thing called BECCS, bioenergy with CCS, in which you basically ask vegetation to pull the CO2 out of the air, you burn it to make power, and then you put the CO2 underground. But you can also just pull CO2 out of the air. I'm sure you all remember Apollo 13, where they spent the middle part of the movie saying, quick, we got to make a device that scrubs CO2 out of our things. It's like this technology's been around for a long time. And you were talking about this, Dr. Extavour, about the respirator technology. We've known how to pull CO2 out of the air of spacecraft and submarines for a very long time. We just got to make it cheaper and easier and more efficient. And again, these miracle materials we're designing in the computer, and we're fabricating in a lab, and we're printing into novel reactors give us an opportunity to do this that is no longer nuts. And the way we know it's no longer nuts is there are 2 companies who are selling CO2 from the air today, and they're making money. So there's an opportunity out there, and all of those guys say that by 10, 15 years from now, if their business evolves the way they'd like it to be, they're going to be down to $150 a ton. You might believe that, you might not. You know, onus is on us at this point because they're making money. So, and in fact, last word on this, I have the good fortune of actually going to Iceland in October. I'm going to attend the ribbon cutting of the world's first negative emissions power plant. We're actually slapping a direct care capture device on the backside of a zero emission geothermal power plant, which is injecting its co-produced CO2, the CarbFix project. Direct air capture plus CarbFix equals negative emissions. And when we've already started selling subscriptions, people are buying the offsets. Although to be clear, we don't call them offsets, we call them insets. Because in fact, you're cleaning up your room. It's not the same thing as an offset. It's an onset or an inset.
Just a follow-on question to that one. How much, and this is Marcus and Julio, you guys probably know how much R&D is focused on direct air capture versus point source capture?
So let's take a step back. Over the past 10 years, $2.2 trillion have been deployed in clean energy deployment and research. Out of that, less than 1% has been on CCS. So $20 billion worldwide over the last decade. Out of that, about $3 million of government money have gone into air capture. There is only one national program anywhere in the world on negative emissions. That's in the UK. When I was at the DOE, I had the good fortune of starting a tiny air capture program. The Department of Agriculture has a tiny carbon removal program, but it is really tiny. We have to scale this industry pretty soon to 10 gigatons a year. That's the math. For those people who pay attention, 10 gigatons is equal to the entire flow of oil in the world. It's a huge volume. 10 gigatons is 20 times the weight of all the human beings on Earth. It's just a big number. And we're not going to get there at $3 million a year.
This is a different way of answering that question, which is a total dodge because I actually don't know the numbers, but Dr. Friedmann does. When we were soliciting teams for the competition 2 years ago, when we said, yeah, we're launching, enter if you'd like. We got hundreds of inquiries from people doing CO2 conversion. I'm aware of 3 different going concern companies doing air capture, and I think we received something like 7 or 8 inquiries from air capture organizations saying, we're thinking about checking out this prize. Are we interested? That's not a comment necessarily on those technologies, but it's a comment on, I think, funding levels. R&D flows directly with these things.
And even interest level.
Yeah, one last word on this. I should have said this earlier. If you're going to actually have a circular economy or a cradle-to-cradle sort of stuff, you're going to ultimately be making all these carbon products out of CO2 you pull from the air. And in fact, most of the people who are doing CO2 capture from